Welcome. You clicked on a 4-hour video about useless Elder Scrolls lore facts. I'm not going to judge you for that. I'm the one who made it. Let's just both accept who we are as people and get into it. I want to be upfront about something before we start. A lot of what we're going to talk about today isn't clean. Elder Scrolls lore is famous for being deliberately contradictory, for having unreliable narrators, for having in-universe books that disagree with each other about basic facts. And that's on purpose. The writers have always leaned into the idea that mythology and history in Tamriel work the same way they work in the real world, which is that nobody agrees on anything, everyone's got an agenda, and the truth is usually somewhere messy in the middle. So when I say something happened, what I mean is that at least some sources say it happened, and there's usually a competing account somewhere that says the complete opposite. That's not a bug in the lore. That's the whole flavor of it. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Like, the actual beginning. Before Tamriel, before Nirn, before time itself. We're starting at the point where there's just two things, two primordial forces, Anu and Padomai. Most creation myths across history have some version of this. Two opposing forces, two primal energies, and whatever happens when they touch each other. Elder Scrolls has Anu and Padomai. In most tellings, Anu is something like stasis, or order, or light. Padomai is change, chaos, darkness. They're not exactly conscious beings the way you and I are conscious. They're more like principles, forces. The annotated Anuad, which is one of the in-universe texts that tries to explain all of this, describes them as light and darkness, and says that their interplay was what created basically everything else. But here's where it already gets weird, because one of the things their interaction created was a being called Nier, and Anu loved Nier, and Padomai did not get along with either of them. And this rivalry, this conflict between Anu and Padomai led to Nier being killed, and the 12 worlds they had all inhabited together being destroyed. And out of that destruction, out of the blood of these two primordial forces mingling together, came the Etada, which translates roughly to original spirits, or Ur-gods, depending on the source. Now, the Etada is the collective term for all the beings that we would eventually call gods before the world was made, before time existed. They're just sort of floating around in this primordial soup of magic and chaos called the Orbis, which is sort of the name for the whole of existence, and they're figuring out what they are and what they're supposed to do. The word Orbis, by the way, is one of those words that shows up in Elder Scrolls that you could spend an entire afternoon trying to parse. Broadly, the Orbis is the totality of everything, Mundus, Oblivion, Aetherius, all of it. Think of it as the universe container, the box that holds all the stuff. Within the Orbis, you've got Aetherius, which is the magical realm where the Aedra mostly reside, and Oblivion, which is the plane of the Daedra, and Mundus, which is the mortal world that got made later through some very dubious means. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Etada. So these original spirits are hanging around, and they've got identities, they've got personalities, they've got wants and fears and all of that. And one of the most important things about how they work, one of the things that makes the whole cosmology tick, is this. The Etada are sorted not by whether they're good or evil, but by their relationship to a specific event, the creation of the world. Because the creation of Mundus, which is the mortal plane where all the Elder Scrolls games take place, wasn't supposed to happen. Or if it was supposed to happen, the way it happened was definitely not supposed to happen, and the whole thing was the idea of one specific Etada, a being named Lorkhan. Alright, next fact. So, Lorkhan, let's talk about Lorkhan. In basically every culture on Tamriel, Lorkhan is the missing god, the dead god, the trickster god. The guy who did the thing that everyone either loves him or hates him for, depending on who you ask. And the thing he did was convince the other original spirits to help him make a mortal world. Now, Depending on the source, he either genuinely believed this was a good idea or he tricked everyone into doing it under false pretenses. Most High Elven accounts are firmly in the "he is a treacherous lying villain and we hate him" camp. Most Nord accounts treat him as a kind of tragic hero, calling him Shor. The Bretons have their own version. The Redguards have a totally different version that doesn't even use the same names. And the Khajiit have a version that, honestly, might be the most coherent of the lot, which we'll get to. But the broad strokes that most sources agree on go something like this. Lorkhan looked at the Arbis, this vast infinite magical expanse, and decided it needed something at the center of the cosmic wheel, something physical and mortal and finite. A place where things could change and grow and die. And to make that place, you needed the other Etara to give up pieces of themselves. To sacrifice their power and their immortality and their divine essence into the raw material of a new world. And the other spirits, or at least a large number of them, said yes. Some say they were convinced. Some say they were tricked into it under false pretenses. Some say Lorkhan genuinely believed in what he was doing and wasn't lying to anyone. But the result was the same. A big chunk of the Etada poured themselves into this new place, and in doing so, they became bound to it. They gave up so much of their divine essence that they could no longer fully escape the mortal plane. They were diminished, weakened, tethered to Mundus in ways they hadn't been before. Those spirits, the ones who went in, are the Aedra. And in Aldmeri, the language of the ancient elves, Aedra literally means our ancestors, because the elves see themselves as descended from these beings. The Etada, who looked at what Lorkhan was proposing and said, "Nope, not doing that, thanks, I'll make my own worlds in Oblivion," those are the Daedra, which means, again in Aldmeri, not our ancestors. So the whole distinction between Aedra and Daedra, the whole god versus demon framing that most of Tamrielic religion is built on, isn't actually about morality at all. It's about whether you participated in a real estate project. The Aedra got weaker by choosing to help. The Daedra kept their power by refusing to help. And the mortal races of Nirn inherited the world built by the first group and are constantly poked and prodded by the second group. There's this line from an in-game text that I think captures the irony of the whole thing really well. The Aedra, despite being worshipped as benevolent creator gods, can actually be killed because they're bound to Mundus. The Daedra, who tend to get labeled as demons and monsters, can be permanently destroyed. They can just be banished back to Oblivion, where they regenerate and come back. So the good gods are the vulnerable ones, and the evil gods are the effectively immortal ones. That's Elder Scrolls cosmology for you. The moment you think you've got a clear moral picture, it blurs on you. Now, what happened to Lorkhan after all of this? Short answer, they ripped out his heart. Longer answer, the Aedra who survived the creation of Mundus, including the bigwig, Ariel, who is the elven version of Akatosh, were furious. They confronted Lorkhan and they punished him. Depending on the source, they killed him or they stripped out the source of his power, which was his heart, and his body was flung across the sky to become the moons. Maser and Secunda, the two moons of Nirn that you can see in the games, are what's left of Lorkhan's corpse in some tellings. His actual beating heart was cast down into the earth, where it became embedded in the rock beneath a volcano in Morrowind. And that heart, that literal divine heartbeat of the god who made the world, becomes absolutely central to the plot of Morrowind, the third game, but we'll get there. The point for right now is this: the world exists because of a betrayal, or an idealistic project, or a trick, depending on who you ask. And the consequences of that moment, of Lorkhan's plan and what happened to him, ripple out through literally all of recorded Tamrielic history. Everything we're about to talk about for the next few hours connects back to this one event in ways both obvious and absolutely insane. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so let's dig into this a bit more, because the Aedra and Daedra thing is one of those areas where the more you learn, the less certain you become about anything. Start with the Aedra. You've got the A Divines, or 9 Divines, after Talos gets added in the Third Era, who are worshipped throughout most of Tamriel. Akatosh, the dragon god of time, who is arguably the most important deity in the setting, Arche, the god of the cycle of life and death, Kynareth, the nature goddess, Mara, the goddess of love, Stendarr, the god of mercy, Dibella, the goddess of beauty, Zenitar, the god of work and commerce, and Julianus, the god of wisdom. These are the Aedra that most Imperials and Bretons and Nords worship as benevolent creator gods. They're usually depicted as distant. They don't just walk around near and handing out quests and giving people enchanted weapons. They're weakened from the creation of the world and can only interact with mortals in limited ways, through shrines and blessings and the occasional extraordinarily dramatic moment. The Daedric princes, on the other hand, show up all the time. They've got shrines, they've got cults, they hand out artifacts, they drag you into their crazy pocket dimensions and give you tasks to complete. They're way more interactive. And that's because they kept their full power. They didn't pour themselves into Mundus, so they can engage with mortals at full strength. The trade-off is that they can't create things in the way the Aedra did. They can only change things, manipulate things, work with what already exists. But here's where the line between Aedra and Daedra starts to fray. Take Malacath, the Daedric prince of the spurned and the ostracized, the patron of the orcs, a genuinely ferocious and powerful entity. Malacath is one of the Daedra who refused to participate in the creation of Mundus, right? Except, not exactly. Malacath used to be Trinimac. Trinimac was one of the Aedra, one of the more powerful ones, actually a warrior god worshipped by the ancient elves, and Trinimac was literally eaten by Boethia. Boethia is the Daedric prince of deceit and plots and dark schemes, and at some point she literally consumed Trinimac, like swallowed him whole, and wore his form and spoke in his voice to trick the ancient Chimer, which we'll get to, and then excreted what was left of him, and what came out was Malacath. So Malacath is a Daedric prince who used to be an Aedra. His existence completely breaks the simple Aedra are good gods, Daedra are bad gods framing. He didn't refuse to help make the world. He got digested by another god and turned into something else entirely. And then there's Meridia. Meridia is classified as a Daedric prince. She's got her own realm of oblivion. She shows up in Skyrim asking you to purge the undead with her artifact. But Meridia wasn't born from Padome's blood, the way most Daedra supposedly were. She was originally a Magna G, one of Magnus's followers, a group of spirits that actually did participate in the early stages of making Mundus, and then fled before it was complete, punching holes in the sky as they left, which is why stars exist, according to this account. So Meridia started in the Anuic camp, the light and order side of the original equation, and somehow ended up classified as a Daedra. Every time you find a clean line in this cosmology and try to draw it, you find something that crosses right through it. The Daedra who came from the blood of Anu, the Aedra who got turned into a Daedric prince, the mortal who became a divine. It's all there if you go looking. Speaking of mortals becoming divines, Talos, the 9th divine, the biggest theological controversy in the entire Elder Scrolls setting. Talos is Tiber Septim, or maybe 3 people all at once, depending on which account you believe. He was a mortal human who unified all of Tamriel through conquest and also through a giant brass robot god, which we will absolutely get into, and then after he died he became the 9th divine, worshipped as a god of war and governance and the empire itself. The Thalmor, the high elven political faction that's basically running the Aldmeri dominion by the time of Skyrim, deny his divinity completely. They consider the worship of a mortal as a genuine god to be blasphemous and offensive, and they use their political leverage after a major war to force the Empire to ban Talos worship, which is why there are secret Talos shrines in Skyrim. But the thing is, in the Elder Scrolls cosmology, being a god isn't necessarily about what you were born as. It's about what you become, and whether people believe in you, and whether you're powerful enough to hold the position. Mortals can become gods. It's happened before. The Tribunal of Morrowind did it. There's a whole metaphysical mechanism called mantling that we'll talk about later. So whether Talos was really a god or not is a question that doesn't have a simple factual answer. It's genuinely philosophical and political and depends entirely on which framework you use to evaluate it. And the Thalmor know this, by the way. Some scholars in the lore suggest that the reason the Thalmor want so badly to suppress Talos worship isn't because they genuinely believe he's not a god. It's because, if he is a god, if a human really did ascend to godhood, then the Altmeri claim of inherent racial and cultural superiority over humans gets really complicated really fast. Here's another one. Okay, the towers. This is one of my favorite pieces of Elder Scrolls lore, and also one of the most underexplored in the games themselves. So after Mundus was made, after Lorkhan's project was completed and the dust settled and the Aedra were either bound to the world or fled to Aetherius, there was a problem. Mundus, the mortal plane, is fundamentally unstable. Reality in the Elder Scrolls cosmology needs anchors. Without something actively keeping the world solid and coherent and real, it would just dissolve back into the raw chaos of the Dawn era. Things would stop making sense. Time would stop being linear. Existence would basically opt out of being a going concern. And the things that provide those anchors are called the towers. Each tower is a massive structure of some kind, sometimes a literal tower, sometimes something more abstract, and each one has a stone, which is the actual power source, the thing that the tower uses to interact with reality and keep it stable. As long as the tower stands and the stone is active, that piece of reality holds together. The first and most important tower is the Adamantine Tower, also called Adamantia, or sometimes just the first tower. It's located on an island called Balfiera in the Iliac Bay region, between High Rock and Hammerfell. This is supposedly the oldest structure in the world. It was built in the Dawn era, during the convention where the Aedra met and decided what to do about Lorkhan after the world was made. Some accounts say the meeting that condemned Lorkhan happened right there, on top of or inside this tower. Its stone is the convention itself, the political agreement, the moment of decision, the act of creation being stabilized through collective will. Then you've got the Crystal Tower, or Crystal-like Law, on the Somerset Isles, the home of the High Elves. This is the gleaming white spire that the Altmer have always used as the symbol of their civilization and their connection to the divine. Its stone, the heart of transparent law, is, well, you can probably guess from the name. There's a whole series of quests in Elder Scrolls Online about what happens when someone tries to steal it. The Red Tower is Red Mountain in Morrowind. This one you've definitely heard of if you've played any of the games. Red Mountain sits at the center of the island of Vardenfell, and it's a volcano that's been erupting off and on for thousands of years. And its stone is the heart of Lorkhan, Lorkhan's actual heart, the literal divine organ of the god who created the world, still beating, buried deep beneath the volcano. The Red Tower uses that heartbeat as its anchor, its power source, its reason for keeping that section of reality intact. Which means that for all of recorded history, the stability of Morrowind and potentially much more has been depending on the still functioning heart of the dead god who made everything. And people have been messing with that heart, constantly, with terrible results, which we'll get to. There's also the White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil, the Imperial City's main landmark, the tower at the center of the Empire, originally built by the Eyelid Elves of the First Era. The Snow Tower in Skyrim, which is the throat of the world, the massive mountain at the center of Skyrim, where the Greybeards live. The Walkbrass Tower, also called Numidium, which is the giant brass robot god, Yes, the towers list includes a robot. The Green Sap Tower in Valenwood, connected to the Bosmer and their pact with the Green, and a few others that are more obscure. The key thing about the towers is that if they fall, if their stones get deactivated or corrupted or removed, then that region of Mundus becomes increasingly unstable. Reality starts to fray. And there's a heavy implication in a lot of the deeper lore that the reason the world of Tamriel has been getting gradually more troubled over the course of the games, more plagues, more invasions, more cosmic threats, more existential weirdness, is that the towers have been going dark, one by one. The Red Tower's stone was removed at the end of Morrowind, when Lorkhan's heart was freed, and the enchantments on it broken. That's what caused Red Mountain to fully erupt, which caused the Red Year, which was a volcanic disaster that basically ended Dunmer civilization as it existed on Vardenfell, and drove most of the surviving population off the island. So, yeah, every major catastrophe in the games has a tower attached to it somewhere. And once you know that, you start seeing the franchise's history in a completely different way. Next one. Let me tell you about the Dwemer. You know the Dwemer. You've walked through their ruins in Skyrim. You've been jumped by their automated centurions, you've collected their scrap metal, you've wondered why every single one of their traps still works perfectly after thousands of years. The Dwemer, also called dwarves, which is a misnomer, they had nothing to do with dwarves, were the most technologically advanced civilization Tamriel has ever seen, by a margin so wide it's almost funny. They were doing things in the First Era that nobody else in Tamriel can replicate even in the Fourth Era, and they all vanished, every single one of them, in an instant. In First Era 700, during a battle, every Dwemer on the face of Nirn disappeared simultaneously, leaving behind nothing but their empty cities and their still-running machines, and one very confused individual named Yagrum Bagarn, who happened to be off-world, and thus missed the event. Yagrum Bagarn is the last living Dwemer, and you can meet him in Morrowind. He's not in great shape, he's got corpus disease, a magical illness that makes your body slowly distort and grow, but he's alive, and he's as baffled by what happened as anyone. So what happened? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain, and the game deliberately keeps it ambiguous. But we have a pretty solid picture of the events leading up to it, and they are, to put it mildly, a lot. The Dwemer were, in theological terms, basically atheists. Or maybe more accurately, they were the medieval equivalent of someone who knows that gods exist, they could see empirical evidence of divine power, but who decided that organized worship of those gods was not for them. Their whole civilization was built around tonal architecture, which is essentially the application of sound and vibration to reality itself. They had figured out that existence has an underlying mathematical structure, and that if you understand that structure well enough, you can manipulate it through specific resonant frequencies. All of their technology, the automatons, the lifts, the centurions, runs on this principle, and then their miners found the heart of Lorkhan, buried deep under Red Mountain, still beating. The literal cardiac organ of the god who made the world. And their chief engineer, a genius named Kagranak, looked at it and thought, we can use this. We can use this to transcend mortality, to make our whole race divine, to step outside the limitations of Mundus entirely. Kagranak built 3 tools. Wraithguard, a gauntlet that let you touch the heart safely. Sunder, a hammer that would resonate the heart at specific frequencies. Keening, a blade that would attune the power being drawn from the heart. And his plan was to use these tools on the heart to fundamentally rewrite what the Dwemer were, to attach their souls to the heart's power and use that connection to achieve some form of apotheosis. What he also built as a vessel for this new divine form was Numidium, a colossal mechanical golem, thousands of feet tall, powered by the heart of Lorkhan, designed to be a new god for the Dwemer people to either become or inhabit or use to transcend existence, depending on which source you're reading. But the Chimer, the ancient elves who would eventually become the Dark Elves, the Dunmer, had their own claim on Morrowind. And their leader, Indoril Nerevar, found out about what the Dwemer were doing, and he confronted his friend, the Dwemer King Dumak, about it, and that confrontation tipped over into war. The War of the First Council, and in the Battle of Red Mountain, in the year First Era 700, it all came to a head. The details of what exactly happened in that battle vary wildly by source. Vivek's account is one version. The Ashlander oral histories are another. There are Nord accounts, historical analyses, dissident writings that dispute the official temple version. But the most commonly repeated story goes roughly like this. Kagernak struck the heart with his tools at a critical moment in the battle, and the result was that every single Dwemer on Nirn vanished at the same time. Where did they go? Yagrum Bagarn, when you meet him in Morrowind and ask him about it, doesn't know. He says he thinks Kagernak might have succeeded in granting their race eternal life, but with unforeseen consequences, specifically wholesale displacement to some other plane of existence. Maybe they became part of Numidium, maybe they became some kind of collective oversoul, maybe they got sucked into the heart and destroyed, maybe they transcended entirely and went somewhere we can't perceive. There's a quest in Skyrim where a mage named Arniel Gain tries to recreate what Kagernak did using a Dwemer warped soul gem and the blade Keening. And Arniel succeeds, sort of. He disappears. Vanishes completely, leaving nothing behind but a shade, a ghost version of himself that you can summon afterward. If Kagernak's experiment worked similarly but at a mass scale, the Dwemer might all be Arniel-style ghosts, bound to Numidium or to the heart or to something we haven't discovered yet. One thing that makes this even weirder is the timing. The Dwemer who had relocated to Hammerfell before the battle, a whole clan called the Rorken who disagreed with what Kagernak was doing and left Morrowind specifically to get away from it, also vanished at the exact same moment. They weren't anywhere near Red Mountain. They were on a completely different continent. Whatever Kagernak did reached out and took them all. And their machines kept running, still are running, thousands of years later. The Centurions in Dwemer ruins in Skyrim are still powered up, still hostile, still functioning exactly as designed. The Dwemer were so good at their craft that their automated systems outlasted them by multiple eras and just keep going. There is something deeply eerie about walking through a Dwemer ruin and hearing the steam pipes hissing and the gears turning, knowing that the people who built all of this just stopped existing one day, and nothing they built got the message. Alright, so, okay, Kim. We need to talk about Kim. Kim is a concept that gets mentioned in a handful of in-game texts, most notably in the 36 Lessons of Vivek, which is a series of books written by the Dunmer god warrior Vivek that are deliberately cryptic and strange and require a lot of unpacking. Kim is not fully explained in any single source. You have to piece it together from fragments, and the picture you end up with is a lot. So let's start from the ground level. In Elder Scrolls cosmology, reality is built on a strange metaphysical foundation. Anu, the primordial force of stasis and light, is sometimes described as the everything, as in, literally everything that exists is either Anu or an aspect of Anu, which would mean that you and me and the Dragonborn and the planet Nirn and the gods and the whole of the Orbis are all just aspects of this one giant being dreaming itself into existence, and the thing called the Godhead, which shows up occasionally in the deepest lore, is the name for this ultimate dreaming entity. The thing that all of existence is a dream of. If the Godhead woke up, everything would stop existing. The whole of Elder Scrolls lore happens inside a dream. Now, given that, what happens if a mortal becomes aware of this? What happens if someone within the dream realizes that the universe is a dream and that the dreamer is them? Or that they are a part of the dreamer? Or more accurately, what happens if they look at themselves and realize that their own individual I is actually part of an infinite whole, and that infinite whole is the Godhead, and the Godhead is everything? Most beings who reach this realization dissolve. They lose their sense of self. They zero-sum, in the lore's terminology. Their individual identity gets reabsorbed into the universal whole, and they effectively cease to exist as separate entities. You understand that you're not really real in the way you thought you were, and that understanding destroys you. But Kim is what happens when someone goes all the way through that revelation and comes out the other side still intact, still themselves. Someone who looks at the infinite universe and understands that they are simultaneously nothing and everything, that their individual existence is technically an illusion, and who shouts, "I am," into the face of that understanding and makes it stick. The 36 lessons describe this as the secret syllable of royalty. It's written in the Elnofex language as Kim, and in that script it resembles a crowned tower, a shape that symbolizes the union of the individual self and the infinite whole. A person who achieves Kim is called a ruling king in some of the texts. And what can a ruling king do? Well, basically anything. If you've achieved Kim, you've essentially become a lucid dreamer within reality. You know you're in a dream, you know you're part of the dreamer, and that knowledge gives you the ability to bend the dream however you like. You can rewrite the rules. You can alter the physical laws of Nirn. You can do things that would be impossible for any mortal, or even any god who doesn't have this understanding. Vivek claims to have achieved Kim. Most scholars in the lore believe Vivek genuinely did achieve it. And one of the pieces of evidence for this is a story, told obliquely in the lessons, about Vivek encountering Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination and brutality, who is known, among other things, for, let's say, very aggressive dominance as a sphere of influence. And Vivek and Molag Bal had an encounter over a period of 80 days that produced offspring. And those offspring are described as the origin point of the winged twilight creatures that you can fight in the games. I mention this mostly because the 36 Lessons is a text that, upon first reading, seems like it might be some kind of mystical, philosophical poetry, and then you get to certain sections and go, oh, this is just an explicit description of a god doing extremely explicit things. It's that kind of book. But Kim comes up in a much more important context when we get to Tiber Septim, because some accounts suggest that what Tiber Septim did, his apotheosis, his becoming Talos the Divine, involved achieving Kim or something very like it. And if that's true, it changes the whole nature of what Talos is. For now though, the main things to know about Kim are, it's the process of understanding you're in a dream and maintaining your identity through that understanding. Achieving it gives you godlike power over reality. Failing to achieve it causes you to stop existing, and the number of beings who have successfully done it is very, very small. And this one's a big one. So something happens when beings of sufficient power interact with the fabric of time in certain ways. Specifically, time breaks. Not metaphorically, not as an expression. Time actually literally breaks. Causality stops functioning. Linearity goes out the window. Multiple things that contradict each other happen simultaneously and are all equally real. And this event is called a dragon break. The name comes from Akatosh, the dragon god of time. To break time is to break the dragon, hence dragon break. The mechanics of a dragon break, as best as the lore describes them, go something like this. Normally, time in the Elder Scrolls universe is linear. Things happen in a sequence. Causes produce effects. One moment leads to the next. Akatosh maintains this. He's the god of time. He keeps it flowing in the right direction. A dragon break happens when something interferes with this process at a deep enough level that time's linearity becomes unstable. And when that happens, multiple contradictory versions of events all become simultaneously real. They all happened. They all keep happening. Time during a dragon break is nonlinear. Things that should be mutually exclusive can coexist, because the rules that would make them exclusive have stopped applying. At the end of a dragon break, history sort of reconstitutes itself. The timeline becomes linear again, but everything that happened during the break is still real. All of it, every version, every possibility, all simultaneously true. Now, why does this matter for the games? The most famous dragon break in the series is the Warp in the West, which is the in-universe name for the ending of The Elder Scrolls II: Daggerfall. Daggerfall, which came out in 1996, had multiple possible endings. Depending on your choices in the game, one of 7 different factions could end up controlling the Numidium, the giant brass robot god we'll talk about in detail later, and use its power to achieve their goals. Different endings produced completely different results for the political landscape of the Iliac Bay region. The problem was that a sequel to Daggerfall would have to pick one of those endings as the real one and ignore the others, which would mean telling a large portion of the player base that their experience of the game wasn't the canonical one. Bethesda's solution was, in hindsight, absolutely brilliant: the Warp in the West. In the canonical history of Tamriel, all 7 endings happened simultaneously. It was a dragon break. For roughly 2 days, though time was so distorted that some people experienced those 2 days as much shorter or much longer, every faction simultaneously achieved its goals using 7 different Numidiums that existed at the same time in the same place. The political landscape of High Rock was completely remade overnight. The 44 petty kingdoms of the Iliac Bay were consolidated into 4 major powers, and nobody who lived through it could really explain what had happened, because the experience of living through a dragon break is described as deeply disorienting and largely impossible to remember clearly. The accounts of the Warp in the West include things like entire armies teleporting hundreds of miles instantaneously, days of events vanishing from people's memories, while other events are remembered that couldn't possibly have happened in the time available, storms and earthquakes and celestial phenomena without explanation, and the general sense that 2 days passed but somehow a decade's worth of events also happened. The only beings who could see through a dragon break and maintain a coherent perspective on what was happening were the Khajiit, because of their unique relationship to the moons, Maser and Secunda, which are connected to Lorkhan's heart and thus to time itself. And the Khajiit, per their own accounts, mostly use this advantage to watch everyone else go completely mad. The other major dragon break you need to know about is the Middle Dawn, which takes us to one of the most unhinged organizations in the history of Tamriel. Okay, I want you to take a moment to appreciate just how deranged this next section of history is. Because we're going to talk about a group of religious extremists who accidentally, or possibly intentionally, broke time for over 1,000 years, and nobody's entirely sure what actually happened during those 1,000 years because time wasn't working. Let's start with the Alessian Order. Following the Alessian slave rebellion in the early First Era, which is the event that ended the Aelid domination of Cyrodiil, the humans who had been freed under the leadership of Alessia established their own empire. And alongside that empire grew a religious movement, the Alessian Order, named after the prophet Maruk, who claimed to have received visions from the spirit of Alessia herself. The Alessian Order was monotheistic, which was pretty unusual for Tamriel, where most religions acknowledge multiple gods. The Order believed in one supreme god and worked to stamp out the influence of the elven religions, particularly the Aldmeri worship of Auriel. And here's the thing that's important for our purposes. In Aldmeri theology, Auriel and Akatosh are the same god, the dragon god of time, just known by different names in different cultures. The Marukati Selectives were a splinter sect within the Alessian Order, and their specific obsession was this: they were absolutely convinced that Akatosh, the imperial version of the time god, and Auriel, the elven version, were not the same being at all. That Akatosh had been contaminated by the elven religious concept of Auriel, and that this contamination needed to be removed. They called this process the sacred expungement. Now, how do you remove the elven aspects from a god? How do you surgically alter the metaphysical nature of the deity of time? The Selectives' answer was to gather 8 pieces of an artifact called the Staff of Towers, which was a physical representation of the Adric forces holding Mundus together, and to perform a ritual using it. Their secret leader, who was also, apparently, the person publicly leading the opposition to the Selectives in a very on-brand conspiratorial move, channeled the Aurbis itself through the staff. Each selective entered a meditative state of what they called monothought. The staff appeared before them, and the secret master danced upon it until it split into 8 pieces. And time broke, hard. The Middle Dawn, as it came to be called, lasted from First Era 1200 to First Era 2208. That's 1,008 years of nonlinear time. 1,008 years during which every culture on Tamriel has some memory, but all those memories contradict each other wildly. Some sources say certain wars happened, others say those wars never existed. Some describe the sun changing color, some say the gods walked the earth openly. Some Cyrodiilic accounts describe the empire becoming an empire across the stars, or becoming an egg. Nobody agrees on anything because there was no coherent anything to agree on. The one thing that virtually every cultural memory of the Middle Dawn agrees on is this: 8 stars fell from the sky. One by one, 8 stars fell, and then time started working again. Whether the Selectives achieved what they were trying to achieve, whether they successfully purified Akatosh of his elven aspects, is genuinely unknown. The War of Righteousness, which ended the Alessian Order about a century after the Middle Dawn, destroyed most of their records, so we can't even ask them. But if they did succeed, if Akatosh and Auriel are now genuinely different beings because of what the Selectives did, the implications for the entire structure of Tamrielic religion are enormous. Because the High Elves' theological claim to spiritual superiority over humans is partly based on their direct descent from Auriel. And if Auriel and Akatosh are now actually the same god again, or if they were always the same and the Selectives failed, or if they were always different and the whole question is moot, the answer matters enormously to a lot of very important people. The other thing to appreciate about the Middle Dawn is that it's the longest dragon break in recorded history, 1,000 years. Most other dragon breaks are measured in days or months. The Selectives, intentionally or not, broke the fundamental structure of causality for over a millennium. And the aftermath of that break, the political instability, the cultural trauma, the Alessian Order's own collapse, shaped the next several eras of Tamrielic history. Everything connects to everything in this lore. That's what makes it so compelling and also so completely exhausting to try to map out. Right, so let's take a break from the apocalyptic world-breaking stuff and talk about something that is simultaneously charming and deeply weird: the Khajiit and their relationship to the moons. So in Skyrim, when you play as a Khajiit, you're playing as a bipedal humanoid who looks like a cat person. Fur, cat ears, tail, claws. That's it. That's what you see in Skyrim, in Oblivion, in Morrowind. The Khajiit in the games is a pretty consistent visual concept, but the actual lore of the Khajiit is so much stranger than that. According to the Khajiit creation myth, which we'll get to in a moment, the physical form a Khajiit takes is not determined by genetics the way it works for most species. It's determined by the phases of Tamriel's 2 moons at the time of birth. The larger moon, Masser, called Jode in Khajiit, and the smaller moon, Secunda, called Joan, determine what first stock a Khajiit is born into, and there are 17 distinct first stocks, at least. Some sources suggest there might be more than 20, 17 different types of Khajiit. Not just variations on the bipedal cat person look, we're talking about wildly different body plans. At one extreme, you've got the Alfiq. The Alfiq are born when Masser is waning and Secunda is full. They look exactly like domestic house cats, small, quadrupedal, indistinguishable from a normal cat to the casual observer. But the Alfiq are fully sentient. They're intelligent, they can communicate with other Khajiit, they understand spoken language even if they can't speak it themselves. And because most non-Khajiit races don't realize this, Alfiq are sometimes kept as pets by people who have no idea they've just enslaved a person. There are records of Alfiq using their cover as ordinary cats to serve as spies and information gatherers, wandering through noble households and gathering intelligence that they then report back. Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness, is occasionally mentioned as possessing an Alfic form called the Mad Cat that he uses to cause chaos in places where nobody would suspect a cat. At the other extreme, you've got the Sencherat. These are born during different moon phases and are massive, powerful quadrupeds that stand twice the height of a normal human and can weigh as much as 50 high elves. Not 50 pounds, 50 high elves. They're used as battle mounts by other Khajiit. Other Khajiit ride them into battle. The Sencherat are people. They're fully sentient Khajiit, but they're also battle cat mounts. And then there's the Mane. The Mane is a special case, a unique first stock that appears only when a third moon is visible in the sky. Only one mane exists at any given time, and the Khajiit believe they're all the same soul reincarnating into different bodies. Every Khajiit shaves their fur and braids it into the Mane's mane as a sign of respect and connection, or used to, before the Khajiit population got large enough that this became impractical. The mane, weighed down by the accumulated hair of an entire civilization, cannot walk. They're carried on a palanquin. In between these extremes, you've got the Omes, who look so much like Bosmer that they sometimes have to get facial tattoos to identify themselves as Khajiit. The Pahmara, who look like enormous bipedal tigers and are often bodyguards. The Dagi and Dagirat, who live in the high tree branches because they're small and light enough to go where even the wood elves can't reach, and who have a natural affinity for magic. The Suteirat, which is what you're playing as in Morrowind, the Cathay, which is what you're playing as in Oblivion and Skyrim, and various others. When you look at the lineup, it's not just cosmetically different. These are beings with genuinely different body plans, different physical capabilities, different social roles. The first stocks that look more human are commonly employed as diplomats and adventurers because they can move through human-dominated spaces with less suspicion. The first stocks that look more feline live in the trees or serve as cavalry. The Khajiit have essentially built an entire civilization's social structure around the biological diversity that the moons impose on them. Now, the creation myth. The Khajiit have a very specific story about where they came from, and it's gorgeous and a bit heartbreaking, and involves Azura doing something really sweet, depending on your interpretation. So, in the Khajiit version, the goddess Fadomai, who is essentially Azura's mother in Khajiit mythology, gave birth to 3 litters of children in the first quarter. The first litter became the Aedra. The second litter became the Daedra. The third litter included the moons and Azura, and eventually Lorkhaj, the Khajiit name for Lorkhan. Lorkhaj had a dark heart because he was born in darkness, and it was that darkness that drove him to create the mortal plane. After his creation was made, his siblings tore out his heart. But Azura, before any of this happened, was given a secret gift by Fadomai, permission to take one of Nirni's children. Nirni is the Khajiit name for the world goddess, the mother of the mortal races, and reshape them as she saw fit. Azura took a group of forest dwellers, and she shaped them in many forms, one for each purpose they might need. And she named them the Khajiit, and bound them to the lunar lattice, to the movements of the moons, so that they would always be connected to the power of the heavens. When Nirni found out that her children had been taken and transformed, she was furious. She asked Yefer, the Khajiit name for a god of nature who shows up in their mythology as something of a villain, to punish the Khajiit. And Yefer turned their forests into poisonous marshes and their grasslands into dry desert, which is why elsewhere the Khajiit homeland is the way it is. The landscape of the Khajiit homeland is a punishment, but Azura protected them and taught them to change their shapes and bound them to the moons, and so the Khajiit became what they are. There's a detail in the Khajiit origin myth that I want to call out because it's genuinely poetic. Fadomai's gifts to Azura were 3 secrets. The first secret shaped the Khajiit. The second secret taught them to be the best deceivers, to hide their true nature. The third secret Fadomai saved for last and gave to Azura while she was dying. And that secret was, the Khajiit must be able to climb to the winds of Khanarti's breath and set the moons aright, lest everything fail. Which means the Khajiit have a cosmic responsibility. If the moons ever go wrong, if the lunar lattice ever needs fixing, it's the Khajiit's job to sort it out. They're secretly the maintenance crew for the fundamental structure of reality. And by the way, moon sugar, the extremely addictive substance that the Khajiit produce and that can be refined into skooma, is described in Khajiit religious texts as crystallized moonlight, which means that when you buy moon sugar from a Khajiit caravan, what you're technically getting is solidified fragments of divine power from the sky. And the Khajiit consume it as a religious practice because they believe by ingesting it, they're absorbing a piece of the eternal souls of the moon gods. Skooma is moonlight. That's what skooma is, moonlight. I want that to sit with you for a moment. Moving on. And now, from the charming mooncats to the deeply unsettling, let's talk about the Hist. The Hist are a race of sentient trees that grow in the innermost swamps of Black Marsh, the province of the Argonians, and they are, by many accounts, the oldest beings on Nirn. The Argonians themselves believe there was nothing before the Hist, not as a metaphor. Literally, the Hist existed before everything else that currently lives in Tamriel. This is a contested claim, but it's worth taking seriously. The Hist are described as being more ancient than Men or Mer, more ancient than the Khajiit, possibly older than recorded history even begins. Their roots go down so deep into Nirn that they're described as stretching all the way through the planet and out into other realms entirely, and they're connected to each other. All the Hist, everywhere, share a collective consciousness, a hive mind. They communicate through their root systems, which connect all the trees together across vast distances. They are, in effect, one mind distributed across many bodies, which makes them something genuinely alien in the Elder Scrolls cosmology. Not Aedra, not Daedra, not spirits in the traditional sense. Something older and stranger. The relationship between the Hist and the Argonians is one of the most fascinating things in the lore. It starts before birth. When a clutch of Argonian eggs is laid, they are placed near a Hist tree in a hatching pool. And the Hist sap, which is its soul, in a very real sense, seeps into the eggs while the Argonians develop inside. When the Argonians hatch, they drink the sap of the Hist tree, and this does something profound. It gives them their soul. This is not a metaphor in Argonian theology. The sap is the soul. When you drink a Hist's sap, the Hist is literally giving you part of itself as your soul, your identity, your essence. And when an Argonian dies, their soul travels back to the Hist tree and is stored there until another hatchling drinks that particular Hist's sap, and then it's reborn. So the Argonians don't exactly die the way other races do. They get recycled. Their souls return to the tree and become part of the Hist's collective memory, and then they're distributed again to new Argonians who inherit fragments of their ancestors' experiences. This has some wild implications. The Argonians have been continuously reincarnating through the same histories for potentially thousands of years. Their racial memory isn't just cultural, it's literally encoded in the sap. An Argonian who drinks from a particular Hist might inherit skills or memories or personality traits from every Argonian who drew from that tree before them. And if a Hist tree is destroyed, if the sap is drained or corrupted, the souls that were stored there have nowhere to go. They linger. They become something between a ghost and a lost memory, unable to move on. In Elder Scrolls Online's Murkmire DLC, there's a subplot about a tribe of Argonians whose history was damaged and who are slowly losing their identity as a people because their souls can't properly cycle. The Hist are also capable of something genuinely alarming, reshaping the Argonians themselves. The Hist can modify the physical form of Argonians based on need. During the Oblivion Crisis, when Mehrunes Dagon's forces invaded Tamriel and opened gates to the Deadlands everywhere. The Hist called all the Argonians back to Black Marsh, all of them. Argonian slaves throughout the Empire suddenly felt an irresistible pull toward home and started walking. And back in Black Marsh, the Hist physically augmented the Argonians to be better warriors and better able to resist Daedric forces. The Argonians, with the Hist behind them, were the only people in Tamriel who actually pushed back against the Oblivion Crisis effectively, not just defended, pushed back. They counter-invaded Mehrunes Dagon's forces through his own Oblivion Gates. They followed the Daedra into the Deadlands and fought them there. The Hist saw what was coming before it happened and prepared for it. And then, in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis and the Red Year that followed, when Red Mountain erupted and destroyed most of Vardenfell, flooding Morrowind with refugees, the Argonians, still organized and empowered by the Hist, invaded southern Morrowind. The Dunmer, already devastated by the volcanic disaster, couldn't mount an effective defense. The Englail, a nationalist political faction of Argonians who take their orders directly from the Hist, led the invasion and carved out much of what had been Dunmer territory. So, the Hist predicted the Oblivion Crisis, prepared their people for it, organized a military response, and then used the aftermath to expand Argonian territory. The Trees. The Trees did this. The great political mastermind behind the most effective response to one of the worst events in Tamrielic history was a distributed network of sentient swamp trees with a 1,000-year plan. There's also a theory, and this is based on some pretty obscure sources, that the Hist aren't native to Nirn at all, that they come from a completely different plane of existence and were somehow dragged into the mortal world during the Dawn Era, which would mean the things the Argonians worship as their creators are actually cosmic refugees from somewhere else, squatting on Nirn for reasons of their own. The Hist don't volunteer this information. The Argonians, to their credit, also don't particularly feel the need to share their deepest theological mysteries with outsiders. If you're not an Argonian and not connected to the Hist, you basically have to piece this together from fragments. One more detail about the Hist that I genuinely love. The Argonian concept of time, as filtered through the Hist's consciousness, is fundamentally different from how other races experience time. In the novel The Infernal City, an Argonian character reflects on how his people don't really have a word for time in the linear sense, because the Hist doesn't experience the past and present and future as separate things. For the Hist, all of history is happening simultaneously, and time as a linear sequence is just a convention that lesser beings use because they can't handle the full picture. The Hist might be watching everything that has ever happened and everything that will ever happen all at once, right now, while the trees just sit there and drip sap and look like trees. Alright, Vivec. One of the most fascinating characters in Elder Scrolls. One of the most complicated, one of the most morally ambiguous, and the author of the 36 Lessons of Vivec, which is the most genuinely strange piece of in-game writing in the entire franchise. Let's go back to the Battle of Red Mountain. The Chimer, who at this point in history are the Chimer, oh wait, that's the same thing. Chimer is what I'll be using for the ancient Dark Elves, are fighting the Dwemer. And in the aftermath of that battle, when the Dwemer vanish and the Numidium shuts down, the Chimer's leader, Indoril Nerevar, is dying from wounds sustained in the battle. And his three generals, Almalexia, Sotasil, and Vivec, are faced with a choice. They have Kagernak's tools, Wraithguard, Sunder, Keening, and they have access to the heart of Lorkhan, and they know from what Nerevar and Azura demonstrated that you can use those tools on the heart to tap its divine power. The official story of the Tribunal Temple says that Nerevar told them not to use the tools, that he made them swear an oath to Azura that they would never touch the heart again, and they kept their word. But an alternative account, told by an Ashlander named Alandro Sul, who was Nerevar's shield companion and who lived among the Ashlanders after the battle, says something different. Alandro Sul's account says the tribunal broke their oath, that after Nerevar was carried away from the battle, they went back and used the tools on the heart themselves, that they drew divine power from Lorkhan's heart and used it to make themselves gods, and Azura appeared to curse them for the betrayal. She told them they would never be true gods, that they would know false godhood, that one day a hero would come, reborn from Nerevar's own soul, who would undo what they had done. This is the Nerevarine prophecy, and is the main quest of Morrowind. So Vivec, along with Almalexia and Sotasil, became the living gods of the Dunmer. For thousands of years, from roughly 1st Era 700 to 3rd Era 427, a span that covers almost the entire 2nd and 3rd Eras, the Tribunal reigned as the divine rulers of Morrowind. Vivec especially was beloved. He lived among his people in a city that bore his name. He wrote the 36 Lessons, those strange meditative texts that doubled as prophecy and as misdirection. He fought off multiple invasions, most famously stopping an Akaviri invasion by flooding Morrowind and then teaching the people how to breathe underwater for exactly 1 day, just long enough for the flood to do its work and then recede. Vivec is described as half Khmer and half Dunmer in appearance, a reference to existing in a state between what the Khmer were before the curse of Azura turned them dark-skinned and red-eyed, and what they became after. He is described as a hermaphrodite, referred to in texts as mother-father and sister-brother, who existed beyond conventional gender in ways that the 36 Lessons explore through some extremely vivid metaphors. He carried a weapon called Muatra, which is described in ways that make it very clear this is not a conventional spear. The 36 Lessons are worth spending time with if you haven't already, but I want to give you a few highlights because they're representative of just how weird this text is. Sermon 2 has Vivec fighting a Boyan Armiger and cutting off his own head to use as a weapon. Sermon 14 describes the 80-day encounter with Molag Bal that we mentioned earlier. Sermon 21, which is the one that gets the most attention from lore scholars, is about the wheel and the tower, and provides the key text for understanding Kim. Sermon 36 describes the Battle of Red Mountain through Vivec's perspective in a way that raises more questions than it answers. There's a line in Sermon 1 that tends to stick in people's heads, "For I have crushed the world with my left hand, but in my right hand is how it could have won against me. Love is under my will only." That's the kind of writing style we're dealing with. Dense, symbolic, possibly metaphysical, possibly just incredibly strange poetry. Probably both simultaneously. Vivec also protected Vardenfell from an asteroid. There's a giant rock called Bar Dao, also known as the Ministry of Truth, that Sheogorath flung at Vivec's city because that's what Sheogorath does when he's bored, I guess, and Vivec stopped it in mid-flight, and it just hung there, suspended above the city by Vivec's power. For thousands of years, visitors could go up into the rock, and it served as a prison. If Vivec ever lost his divine power, it would fall and destroy the city. And in 4th Era 5, after the events of Morrowind, after the Nerevarine freed Lorkhan's heart and Vivec lost his divine connection, Bar Dao fell, and it destroyed Vivec's city. And the impact was so violent it triggered Red Mountain's eruption, which caused the Red Year, which ended Dunmer civilization on Vardenfell. All of that, the Red Year, the destruction of a civilization, the refugee crisis that followed, because a Daedric prince of madness threw a rock at a city a few thousand years ago, and a god decided to stop it with his willpower, instead of, just deflecting it somewhere harmless. And Vivec himself? After the events of Morrowind, he disappeared. The last that can be confirmed about him is that he lost his godhood and went mortal again, and oddly, Vivec is described as being relieved about that. Happy to be mortal again, like the burden of godhood was something he'd been carrying for thousands of years and was glad to put down. Where he went after that is unknown. Rumors in Oblivion suggest the Nerevarine killed him. Other sources suggest he simply walked away from Vardenfell and started over somewhere else. The lore has never given us a definitive answer, which is probably intentional. Here's where it gets weirder. I want to talk about Pelinal Whitestrake. Because Pelinal Whitestrake is one of the most genuinely strange characters in the Elder Scrolls franchise, and he mostly shows up as a ghost above the White Gold Tower in the Knights of the Nine DLC for Oblivion, where he's been dead for thousands of years and exists as a fragment of divine armor. But the story of who he was in life is extraordinary. Pelinal Whitestrake, whose name means glorious knight in Elvish, which is a corruption of Pelin-El, the Star-Made Knight, was a demigod who fought alongside the hero queen Alessia during the Alessian Slave Rebellion in the early First Era. The Alessian Slave Rebellion is the event that ended Aelid domination of Cyrodiil. The Aelids, the Wild Elves, had enslaved the humans of Cyrodiil for a very long time. Alessia led the rebellion that ended this, with divine assistance. And two of the beings who helped her were Morihaus, a half-divine son of Kain who basically functioned as a divine cow. Long story. The Elder Scrolls gets into interesting territory with its demigods and Pelinal Whitestrake. Pelinal appeared at Alessia's camp, already covered in the viscera of Aelid chieftains. That's the first thing the historical accounts say about him. He walked in holding a sword and mace, both coated in what was left of elven faces, and introduced himself. He was extraordinarily effective at killing elves, too effective. Accounts describe him going into berserker states so violent that it disturbed the gods themselves. The 8 divines are described as looking away in disgust at what Pelinal was doing. He killed not just Aelid soldiers, but Aelid civilians. He once mistook a group of Khajiit for elves, because the Khajiit at that time period looked quite elf-like to him, and slaughtered them before realizing his error. This incident, per Khajiit historical accounts, happened during the same era that the Khajiit-looking elves were being genocided, so Pelinal's confusion is somewhat contextually explicable, though the Khajiit themselves did not appreciate it. His left hand is described as being made of a killing light, which is either very poetic or very literal depending on your interpretation. Some lore scholars take this to mean his hand was replaced with some kind of energy weapon, a laser if you want to use modern terminology. His armor is described in the Song of Pelinal as being from the future time. Again, could be metaphorical, could be literal. The Song of Pelinal also contains this passage about his nature. It describes him as a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves, whose facets could unsector and form into a man. He could assemble and disassemble himself. He's a being made of crystalline geometry that could fold itself into human shape. Michael Kirkbride, the writer who created Pelinal and wrote the Song of Pelinal, has said in multiple external posts that Pelinal was a cyborg, a construct of some kind, sent back in time from the future by Kain, the Nord version of Kynareth, the divine mother goddess, specifically to help humanity break free from Aelid domination. The theory, which has some textual support, is that Pelinal came from a future where the High Elves had either won or were poised to win control of Tamriel, and Kain sent him back to make sure the humans had a fighting chance, which would explain some things: the armor from the future time, the mechanical or crystalline nature, the laser hand, the fact that he predicted the coming of Reman Cyrodiil, a figure who wouldn't rise to prominence until long after Pelinal's death, by shouting the word Reman at a critical moment during the rebellion. Pelinal also had a lover, a former slave named Huna, who Pelinal freed and trained as a warrior. Huna was a man, and Huna's death at the hands of an Aelid is described as the thing that first drove Pelinal into his berserker rages. The grief of losing Huna is woven through the Song of Pelinal in ways that, once you notice them, are heartbreaking. So Pelinal was gay, probably a cyborg, probably from the future. Definitely a divine champion, and also almost certainly Eschazarin, an avatar or manifestation of Shor Lorkhan, the missing god, who periodically incarnates in the body of a mortal hero to aid humanity. He gets very, very upset when people suggest this to him and has been recorded as killing people who brought it up, which is probably significant in some way. He killed the eyelid sorcerer king Umaril, but Umaril had wounded him fatally in the process. Pelinal's body was found cut into 8 pieces, and yet his head was still lucid enough to have a conversation with Morehouse before he died. And then his armor became the Crusaders' relics, sacred artifacts that scattered across Tamriel and were eventually collected by the player in Knights of the Nine. Where the 8 pieces of his body went is unknown. There's an implication in some of the more obscure texts that Pelinal isn't just one hero, that he's part of a pattern of champions, a kind of recurring role in Tamrielic history, with predecessors known as Harold Harry Breeks and Hans the Fox. All of them are described as the legendary immortal hero who keeps coming back in different forms, which would make Pelinal less a specific person and more a role that gets filled over and over, a mantle that keeps getting passed down, or he's just one extremely capable divine cyborg from the future. Both interpretations have merit, and this connects to something else. The Sijic Order is the oldest monastic organization in Tamriel. They predate the Mages Guild by a wide margin. They predate most current civilizations. They have been observing the world from their island home of Artaeum for longer than most cultures have existed, and they've pulled their island off of Nirn's surface twice and hidden it somewhere in the Orbis for hundreds of years at a stretch. The Sijic Order started as a group of dissident Aldmer, ancient elves, who disagreed with the direction that Somerset Islander culture was taking. Specifically, they objected to the move away from ancestor worship toward the deification of specific noble bloodlines. The elites of Somerset were essentially arguing that only their ancestors deserved to be worshipped as gods, which was both self-serving and, the dissidents felt, spiritually wrong. So these dissidents left and settled on the island of Artaeum, just south of the main Somerset Isles, and established their own philosophical and magical tradition. Their tradition is called the Old Ways, or the Elder Way. And here's an interesting wrinkle. The Old Ways might not be magic in the conventional Elder Scrolls sense. Conventional magic in the setting is the manipulation of the energy called magicka, which flows from Aetherius through the sun and stars. The Old Ways, by contrast, are described as something more like philosophy of meditation that happens to have magical effects. The Elder Way, one text says, is a philosophy of meditation and study said to bind the forces of nature to the individual will. It differs from magicka in origin, but the effects are much the same. So the Sijic Order might be using something completely different from normal magic that just looks like magic from the outside. The implications of this are left frustratingly open. The Order's name comes from PSJJJJ, which is, yes, that's actually how it's spelled in the lore, PSJJJJ, a derivation of Padome's original name, which in the Aldmeri language predates consonants in a way that linguists in Tamriel are still arguing about. The Order named themselves after this primordial being because they were dedicated to understanding chaos and change, Padomai's essence, as equally valuable to understanding order. Manimarco was a Sijic. Vainus Galerian, the founder of the Mages Guild, was also a Sijic. They were contemporaries in the Order, and their conflict, Manimarco's turn toward dark necromancy versus Galerian's desire to spread magical knowledge to everyone, not just the elite, is one of the defining stories of the Second Era. When Galerian left Artaeum to found the Mages Guild, he had to get permission from the Rite Master to do so. That meeting, where Galerian and the Rite Master and the King of First Hold negotiated the founding of what would become the most powerful magical institution in Tamriel, happened in the year Second Era 230. And shortly after Galerian's departure, the island of Artaeum vanished. The Order literally took their island off the planet. When it disappeared, it didn't go to Oblivion or Aetherius, it left Mundus entirely, entering the deeper Orbis, which is the wider field of existence beyond just the mortal plane. It was gone for approximately 500 years, reappearing around the start of the Third Era. When it came back, the Sejiks who had been on the island when it vanished were also back, seemingly unchanged. Nobody on the outside world knew where they'd been. When asked, the Order refused to explain. The text fragment on Artaeum is written by a traveler named Tors who was allowed to visit the island, and they describe finding the Sephora Tower, Artaeum's main structure, which predates High Elven civilization by hundreds of years. Nobody built it in the time of the Aldmer. It was already there. The Sejik Order didn't build their headquarters. They found it already built and moved in. Who built the Sephora Tower? What was there before the Sejik Order? The lore doesn't say. Sotha Sil, one of the tribunal, trained at Artaeum in the First Era. He's described as having been taught by the Order's Right Master at that time, a being named Iachesis. Iachesis is notable because he's absurdly old, even by Tamrielic standards. By the time of Elder Scrolls Online, he's nearly 4,000 years old, kept alive through the Order's life extension magic. He eventually sacrifices himself at the end of the Somerset storyline in ESO to stop a plan by 3 Daedric princes to remake reality using a stolen artifact. The Sejik Order's relationship to the rest of the world is defined by watchful distance. They observe. They occasionally intervene in situations they consider cosmically significant, sending a few members to give cryptic warnings or retrieve dangerous artifacts. In Skyrim, when the Eye of Magnus is discovered and starts destabilizing things, the Order sends members to the College of Winterhold to manage the situation, appearing and disappearing seemingly at will, always a step ahead of everyone else. They also maintain the Vault of Moawita on Artaeum, which is their storage facility for powerful magical artifacts they've collected over the millennia. Everything that goes in there is heavily warded and never comes back out. The Order doesn't share what they've got, they don't explain why they took it. They just decide something is too dangerous to be out in the world and it vanishes into their collection. The second disappearance of Artaeum happened around 4th Era 100, roughly a century into the 4th Era. This one coincides with the Void Nights, a period when the moons of Nirn disappeared from the sky for 2 years, causing massive upheaval in Khajiit society and the rise of the Third Aldmeri Dominion. The Order's reasons for pulling their island away again aren't confirmed, but the timing is suggestive. They came back for the College of Winterhold situation in 4th Era 201, Skyrim, but only barely, only briefly, and then retreated again. Next fact. Manimarco is one of those characters who keeps showing up across the entire timeline of the Elder Scrolls games, and keeps getting more and more interesting the deeper you go. He starts as an Altmer, a high elf, who joined the Sejik Order as a young man, where he was considered one of the most gifted students the Order had ever seen. Only Vanus Galerion was his equal. But Manimarco's heart, as the historical accounts put it, was dark and cold. Galerion's was bright and warm. And the thing that drove Manimarco toward the dark was his obsession with soul magic, with trapping souls, with learning everything there was to know about the transition between life and death, and using that knowledge to extend his own existence indefinitely. The moment that ended his time with the Sejik Order was when Galerion discovered that Manimarco had been experimenting on sapient beings, trapping their souls without consent, using them in his research. Galerion confronted him under the Sephora Tower and told him to stop. Manimarco refused. Galerion reported him to the Right Master, and the Order's response was to exile him. Galerion later called this decision sending a wolf to flocks of sheep. And he was right. Once Manimarco was out in the world and free of the Order's oversight, he started building. He gathered dark-minded wizards and witches to him. He absorbed the magical power of cursed artifacts. He slowly transformed himself into a lich, a powerful undead sorcerer who trades mortality for a kind of magical immortality. And he founded the Order of the Black Worm, which became the first and most powerful necromantic organization in Tamriel. One of Mani Marco's most significant achievements is the creation of black soul gems. Normal soul gems in the Elder Scrolls can only capture animal souls. They are blocked from capturing the souls of sapient beings by a restriction established by Arche, the god of the life-death cycle. But Mani Marco figured out a workaround. Working with the knowledge he'd gained at the Sijic Order and the artifacts he'd accumulated afterward, he created the Black Soul Gem, a gem that can hold the soul of any sapient being, which circumvented Arche's protection and opened the door to a whole world of deeply unethical magical applications. The book Mani Marco, King of Worms, which exists in Oblivion and Skyrim as an in-game text, describes the epic battle between Mani Marco's necromantic army and Galarian's mage army at some point in the Third Era. Both armies clash in a mountain pass. Fire and frost tear across the landscape. Necromancers raise waves of undead, the mages counter with floods of holy light, and at the climax, Galarian touches the mountain and shakes it to its base, destroying the undead horde. And from the ruins of his army, Mani Marco emerges and breathes out a cold darkness that kills everyone around him, including Galarian. So Galarian dies. The man who founded the Mages Guild, who wanted to spread magical knowledge to everyone, who spent decades opposing Mani Marco, he is killed by his old school rival in a mountain pass. And Mani Marco walks away. But in the Second Era, hundreds of years earlier than any of this, because of how the game's timeline is constructed, Mani Marco was also doing something even more dramatic. He'd aligned himself with Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination, brutal control, and something described diplomatically as the violation of natural order. Their plan? To drag all of Nirn into Coldharbour, Molag Bal's realm of oblivion. Literally pull the planet into a Daedric pocket dimension. This event is called the Plane Meld. Mani Marco's role was to facilitate this from the mortal end, manipulating the political structures of the Empire, gathering souls, conducting massive rituals to weaken the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion. In exchange, Molag Bal promised him power, maybe even godhood. Molag Bal was lying. When Mani Marco eventually tried to claim the power he'd been promised and betray Molag Bal, the Daedric prince grabbed him, dragged him to Coldharbour, and had him tortured for what appears to have been centuries. In ESO, you can actually find him in Coldharbour in a state of profound suffering. Then he apparently escaped, got back to Tamriel eventually, and kept going, because Mani Marco is nothing if not persistent. And then the warp in the west happened. During the Dragon Break at the end of Daggerfall, Mani Marco was one of the beings who got hold of the Totem of Tiber Septim, the control device for Numidium, and used its power to achieve something. And in the aftermath of the break, a new celestial body appeared in the sky, the Necromancer's Moon, also called the Revenant. A body that orbits Nirn and passes in front of Arche's planetary sphere every 8 days, temporarily blocking Arche's influence and allowing necromancers to convert normal soul gems into black soul gems during its eclipse. Mani Marco became a god, literally a deity in the sky, permanently. The King of Worms transcended mortality entirely and became the god of worms, the patron deity of necromancers across Tamriel, with his own celestial body as a constant reminder of his presence. Except, and this is where the Dragon Break gets tricky, the same Mani Marco who just became a god also somehow didn't become a god. Because in the events of Oblivion, set more than 40 years after the warp in the west, there is a mortal Mani Marco who hasn't achieved godhood, who is running a necromantic cult, and who gets killed by the hero of Kvatch. How can both versions exist? The most coherent explanation draws on the nature of Dragon Breaks. The warp in the west created multiple simultaneous timelines, all of which are real. In one timeline, Mani Marco ascended. In another, he didn't. Both happened. Both are true. The god Mani Marco is up in the sky. The mortal Mani Marco is in a cave in Cyrodiil. They're both real, because the Dragon Break made both real simultaneously. Two Money Marcos, coexisting, one divine, one mortal. And the mortal one gets killed, and presumably the divine one just keeps floating around in the sky doing god things. The Necromancer's moon is still there. In Skyrim, 1,000 years later, necromancers still use its eclipses to make black soul gems. Mani Marco won. He just also lost at the same time, because that's what dragon breaks do. Okay, so, of all the Daedric princes in the Elder Scrolls, Sheogorath is probably the most beloved by fans. He's the Daedric Prince of Madness, the Mad God, the Cheese Prince, the Lord of Never There. He appears across multiple games, he's always voiced with tremendous energy and unpredictability, and he has this quality of being genuinely dangerous while also being kind of fun to be around. In Skyrim, you find him in Pelagius Septim III's Haunted Mind, where he's apparently been on vacation since the events of Oblivion's Shivering Isles DLC. But the story of who Sheogorath actually is, underneath the madness, is one of the saddest things in Elder Scrolls lore. There used to be a Daedric prince named Jiggalag, the Grey Prince of Order. He represented logical order and deduction, and the absolute determinism of a universe that follows rules with no exceptions. He maintained a vast library containing a logical prediction of every event that would ever happen anywhere in Mundus or Oblivion. He knew the future, he'd calculated it completely, and he was by many accounts the most powerful of the Daedric princes. His influence spread across the Arbis faster than any other princes. His certainty and his perfection made him a force that kept expanding, kept growing. And the other Daedric princes got scared. All of them. Every single one. They looked at Jiggalag and saw a being whose power was growing faster than theirs, who was methodical and inexorable, and who knew exactly what he was doing at all times. Some accounts say they believed he was the only Daedric prince who truly understood his own nature, and that understanding made him uniquely threatening, so they conspired against him. All the other princes, together, which is itself remarkable, because the Daedric princes don't typically work together, and they cursed him. They cursed Jiggalag to become the incarnation of the thing he hated most. They turned him into Sheogorath, the Prince of Madness, the antithesis of everything Jiggalag was. Order became disorder. Logic became chaos. Certainty became randomness. Jiggalag's perfect mind was shattered and replaced with Sheogorath's magnificent, terrible, unpredictable one. And Sheogorath got Jiggalag's realm, the Shivering Isles, which had been Jiggalag's world of perfect order, and twisted it. It became a realm of madness, divided between mania and dementia, populated with wonderful, broken, delightful beings. Everything Jiggalag had built was torn apart and rebuilt as something mad. But the curse had one provision. Once per era, roughly once every 1,000 years, Jiggalag was allowed to return. He would rise, and his personality would overwhelm Sheogorath, and he would march across the Shivering Isles in the event called the Grey March, destroying everything that Sheogorath had made, restoring it to order. And then, when the Grey March was over, the curse would renew, and he'd become Sheogorath again, and Sheogorath would rebuild everything Jiggalag had just destroyed, over and over. Every era. Jiggalag destroys his own world. Sheogorath rebuilds it. Jiggalag returns and destroys it again, forever. Neither version of this being has any peace. Jiggalag returns to himself just long enough to undo everything his cursed form has made, and then he's dragged back into madness. Sheogorath spends eternity rebuilding a world that will inevitably be raised by his other self. The same consciousness, split into two irreconcilable identities, punished eternally for being too powerful. The Shivering Isles DLC is about ending this cycle. Sheogorath, sensing that the Grey March is coming again, decides to try something different, and invites a mortal champion, the hero of Kvatch, to be his representative in stopping Jiggalag. And through the events of the DLC, the hero essentially mantles Sheogorath, takes on the role, the power, the identity of the Prince of Madness, and uses that to face Jigalag directly. And Jigalag is defeated for the first time, and rather than becoming Sheogorath again, he remains himself. The curse is broken, he's free. After eons of forced madness and eternal cyclical torment, Jigalag walks free in the Arbis, himself again, finally. He gives a speech as he departs that's genuinely moving. He thanks the hero. He names them the new Prince of Madness, since someone has to hold the title now that he's leaving. And he says, simply, that the realm is theirs, that perhaps they'll grow into their station. And then in Skyrim, which takes place more than 200 years after the Shivering Isles events, the person you meet calling himself Sheogorath, wandering around in Pelagius's mind, is referring to the events of Oblivion from a first-person perspective, which strongly implies that the Sheogorath you meet in Skyrim is the hero of Kvatch, who became the new Prince of Madness, and who is now spending their eternity doing exactly what Sheogorath always did. The hero of Kvatch, who saved Cyrodiil from Mehrunes, Dagon's forces, who destroyed the Oblivion Gates, who defeated the King of Worms, who stopped the Grey March and freed an ancient being from eternal cursed madness. That same person apparently accepted the throne of madness and is now living in Pelagius Septim's haunted thoughts, occasionally popping out to mess with things, and calling themselves the Mad God. That's not a bad end to a story, that's a great end to a story. Alright, this one matters. Who is Tiber Septim? This seems like a straightforward question. He's the founder of the Third Empire. He's the Dragonborn Emperor who unified Tamriel. He's the ninth divine. He's Talos, the one whose worship the Thalmor are trying to suppress. You see his shrines in Skyrim. His legend is woven through the entire setting. But the moment you start pulling on that thread, things get complicated extremely fast. The simplest version of the story goes like this. A man named Hjalti Earlybeard was born in the late Second Era, in either High Rock or Atmora, depending on which account you're reading. The sources genuinely contradict each other about his place of origin. He came south, became a general in the service of a petty king named Kulkane, and through military genius and an extraordinary ability to use the Thu'um, the voice-based magic of the Nords, rose to conquer first Cyrodiil and then all of Tamriel. He renamed himself Tiber Septim, founded the Third Empire, became the first and only ruler to unite all 9 provinces of Tamriel under one banner, and upon his death ascended to divinity as Talos. That's the official story, the one the Imperial cult promotes, the one most of Cyrodiil believes. But there are other accounts. The Nords know him as Ysmir, the Dragon of the North, and believe he was a Nord from Atmora. An account from the Dunmer tradition says he was a Breton. The Redguards have their own complicated relationship with his legacy, since he conquered their homeland of Hammerfell by force. And then there's the question of the Mantella, and Wulfharth, and Zurin Arctus, and the possible 3-way person merger that some scholars believe is the actual secret of Talos' godhood. So, Zurin Arctus was Tiber Septim's imperial battle mage, his closest advisor. A brilliant strategist who helped broker many of Septim's conquests diplomatically, including the famous armistice with Morrowind, in which Vivek handed over the Numidium in exchange for Morrowind maintaining its autonomy. Wulfharth Ashking, also known as Ysmir, was an ancient and repeatedly resurrected Nord hero who had been alive and died and come back multiple times across centuries, not through conventional resurrection, but through some deep Atmorian soul magic that kept pulling him back into existence when the Nords needed him. One account, dense and difficult, and possibly allegorical, suggests that Tiber Septim, Zurin Arctus, and Wulfharth merged together at some point. That the being who eventually became Talos was not one mortal, but 3, fused into a single oversoul called the Enantiomorph, a metaphysical configuration described as the 2-headed ruling king that contains multitudes. And it was the power of this fused being, this composite entity of a conqueror, a strategist, and an ancient resurrecting Nord hero that was able to operate Numidium and achieve apotheosis. In this reading, Talos isn't a person, or rather, Talos is three people who became one thing that transcended personhood entirely, which is why the question of whether he's really a god gets so philosophically thorny, because whatever became Talos isn't cleanly describable in the categories we normally use. The Mantella, by the way, is the soul gem that powered Numidium for Tiber Septim. It was created from the soul of Zurin Arctus himself, ripped out of his body by Tiber Septim to fuel the machine. Arctus survived as an entity called the Underking, a ghostly being of immense power, neither dead nor alive, who spent the rest of history trying to reclaim what was taken from him. The Underking shows up in Daggerfall, where his arc concludes. He reclaims his heart from the Mantella during the warp in the west and is finally able to truly die. Thousands of years after Tiber Septim stole his soul, he finally gets to rest, another haunting end to a story. And Tiber Septim himself? He's old when we see him in the real Barenziah, one of the more novelistic books in Elder Scrolls. He's reflective. He's aware that he's not what he once was. There's a quote where he's called the most vigorous and powerful man the person he's talking to has ever met, and he says something like, "Today, perhaps. But I am less than I was yesterday, last year, 10 years ago. I feel the sting of my mortality, and it is painful." A man who was possibly one of the most powerful beings to ever walk Nirn, sitting there saying he feels himself getting old. That's a very human moment for a very mythologized figure, and then he dies and becomes a god. Or maybe the process of becoming a god was already happening while he was alive, through the Numidium and the merger and the Kim or mantling or whatever metaphysical mechanism it was, and dying was just the last step of a process that had already begun years earlier. The Talmor's denial of his divinity isn't entirely wrong from their own internal logic. A human shouldn't be able to become a genuine divine. The rules don't allow for it. But Tiber Septim did things that the rules didn't allow for repeatedly throughout his entire life. He unified a continent that had never been unified. He operated Numidium. He might have achieved Kim. He broke the rules at every turn. Whether you call what he became a real god or not is almost beside the point. He's clearly something, and that something has been shaping reality for centuries. And here's another thing. Let's finally get into the Numidium properly. Numidium, also known as Enumidium, also known as the Brass God, the Prime Gestalt, NM, Walk Brass, Big Walker, the Walking Star, the Divine Skin, the Brass Tower. It was described in one in-game text as a giant so big his hands could knock the moons from the sky, and that's not dramatically wrong as a description of what this thing is. Numidium was built by the Dwemer, specifically by Kagrenac, the tonal architect who also made the tools used on Lorkhan's heart. Numidium was the vessel for Kagrenac's Apotheosis project, the physical shell that the Dwemer race would use to transcend mortality. The power source was Lorkhan's heart, accessed through the tools Kagrenac built. The end result was supposed to be a new god for the Dwemer, a divine construct made of their collective essence. It didn't work out that way. The Dwemer disappeared during the Battle of Red Mountain before Numidium could be properly activated and the machine shut down. But the plans, the blueprints, the partially assembled golem, those survived, and eventually, through a complex series of events, the Numidium came under the control of the Tribunal of Morrowind. Who used it, minus the heart as a power source? Because the heart was also the source of their own divine power and they didn't want to hand that over, to help Tiber Septim in exchange for Morrowind's political autonomy. For Tiber Septim, the Imperial battle mage Zurin Arctus created a replacement power source, the Mantella, forged from Arctus's own stolen soul. And with that power source, and with the control device called the Totem of Tiber Septim that only a being of royal blood could use, Numidium was activated. And in one of the most dramatic applications of force in Tamrielic history, Tiber Septim walked Numidium to the shores of the Somerset Isles and pointed it at Alinor. Alinor, the capital city of the High Elves, was considered by the Altmer to be unconquerable. The Aldmeri dominion had been giving Tiber's armies serious trouble at sea for years. And then a giant brass god walked up and said hello. Alinor surrendered within an afternoon. The entire Aldmeri dominion capitulated. The whole of Tamriel, which no ruler before or since has fully united, fell to Tiber Septim partly because he had Numidium. And this is important context for Skyrim, because the Thalmor in the 4th era are doing everything they can to restore the Aldmeri dominion to supremacy and erase the memory of Tiber Septim's victory. They have very specific reasons for wanting to make sure nobody remembers that a human used a brass god to knock them off their throne. After Septim's conquest, Numidium was destroyed. In the confrontation between Zurin Arctus and Septim over Septim's increasingly tyrannical use of the machine, the Underking smashed it. And the Mantella was lost, thrown into the pocket dimension of Aetherius, called the Mantellan Crux. Numidium sat in pieces, for generations, until Daggerfall. In Daggerfall, the main quest involves recovering the Mantella and the totem, reassembling Numidium, and then choosing who gets to use it. And then the Dragon Break happens, and all 7 possible outcomes happen simultaneously, and everything I described in the Dragon Break section occurs. But here's the thing that makes Numidium more than just a very large weapon. In Elder Scrolls lore, Numidium is also a tower. The Brass Tower. Walk Brass. It's one of the cosmic anchors of reality that I described back in part 4, which means every time Numidium is activated, it's not just a weapon going off, it's a tower being used. And using a tower incorrectly, using it as a weapon rather than as an anchor, has consequences. Specifically, dragon breaks. Every confirmed dragon break in Tamrielic history is connected to either Numidium or the Staff of Towers or some similar misuse of fundamental cosmic infrastructure. Some of the more esoteric lore suggests that Numidium represents Dwemer nihilism as a physical object. The Dwemer didn't believe in the gods. They thought the gods were either illusions or irrelevant. And Numidium, as a god machine powered by the heart of the dead god who made the world, is essentially the Dwemer's philosophical statement made into a 1,000-foot tall metal body. It's a categorical no, as one source puts it. A negation. A giant metallic contradiction of the idea that any of this, the gods, the world, the divine contract, means anything or has any power. When Numidium says no to reality, reality has to deal with it, and it deals with it by breaking. So, we touched on moon sugar earlier, but I want to expand on it because the full picture of what moon sugar is in the Elder Scrolls cosmology is stranger and more interesting than most people know. Moon sugar, called by the Khajiit treat in some dialects, though that might be an outsider's term, is produced primarily in Elsewhere, the Khajiit homeland. It's harvested from sugarcane-like plants that grow particularly well in the arid conditions of the region, and it's addictive, powerfully addictive. For non-Khajiit races, consuming moon sugar produces intense euphoria and hallucinations. Refined moon sugar becomes skooma, which is even more potent and even more addictive. But according to Khajiit religious doctrine, moon sugar isn't just a chemical compound. It's crystallized moonlight, literally pieces of the moons fallen to earth in a form that can be consumed. When a Khajiit ingests moon sugar, they're not just getting a high, they're ritually absorbing the divine essence of Jod and Joan, the moon gods, into themselves. They're communing with the sky. The moons of Tamriel, remember, are the remains of Lorkhan's body after his heart was torn out and his corpse was flung into space. Maser and Secunda are the 2 physical moons, Lorkhan's rotting flesh, as some sources describe it. The dead moon, sometimes called the shadow of Maser, is a 3rd presence around the planet that most people can't see, which the Khajiit can perceive and which they identify as Lorkhan's actual spirit or essence still circling, still present. So moon sugar is processed sunlight filtered through the body of a dead creator god and transformed into a consumable substance. And every time someone uses skooma to get high, they're experiencing a corrupted and addictive version of what the Khajiit use as a sacrament, a connection to the divine cycle of the moons and the cosmic tragedy of Lorcan. This is a deeply religious substance being used recreationally by imperial citizens who have no idea what they're consuming on a metaphysical level. The Khajiit in their caravans know what moon sugar is. The Nord who buys skooma in a tavern absolutely does not. There's also something interesting about how the moon's disappearance affected the Khajiit. During the period called the Void Nights, from around 4th era 98 to 4th era 100, the moons simply vanished from the sky. Nobody knows exactly why. The Thalmor claim to have restored them, which would explain their significant political leverage over the Khajiit in Skyrim. If the Thalmor actually did bring back the moons, the Khajiit owe them a cosmic debt that is very hard to refuse. But if the lunar lattice is what determines which first stock a Khajiit is born into, and the moons disappeared for 2 years, then for that entire period, Khajiit births would have been irregular. Strange, possibly producing first stocks that had never existed before, or producing Khajiit with no first stock at all, or simply failing to produce properly developed Khajiit. The Void Knights are a significant mystery in the lore, and the full consequences haven't been fully mapped out. What the Khajiit remember about that period is terror. The moons are not merely religious symbols for them. The moons are the lunar lattice, the thing that shapes what they are. The absence of the moons was an existential crisis of the highest order. Right. Let's talk about the Daedric Prince of Destruction, Revolution, Change, and Ambition. Mehrunes Dagon, the main villain of Oblivion, the being whose forces tore Tamriel apart in the Oblivion Crisis. And a being who has been trying to invade the mortal plane for literally thousands of years. Mehrunes Dagon is different from most Daedric princes in a few interesting ways. Most of the princes are content to mess with mortals from their own planes of Oblivion, sending occasional agents and artifacts into the world, taking an interest in specific individuals, maybe nudging events here and there. Mehrunes Dagon doesn't do nudging, he invades. His sphere, the thing he's the patron god of, is destruction, revolution, change. But some of his cultists have argued, and some texts support, that his true sphere is hope and change in a more positive sense. That Mehrunes Dagon genuinely believes he's liberating people when he burns their world down, that the destruction he brings is clearing the way for something better. His mythic Dawn cult in Oblivion believe they're entering a paradise after death, that Dagon is a liberator god who will remake the world into something glorious. Whether Dagon actually believes any of this about himself, or whether he just knows it makes good cult recruitment material, is left deliberately ambiguous. His first known attempt to seriously invade Tamriel was in the First Era. He attacked Ald Sota, the ancient home of House Sota, the family from which Sota Sil, one of the future tribunal, came. He destroyed the settlement utterly, killed everyone. Sota Sil survived because he happened to not be there, but he came back to find his entire family and community wiped out. This is the wound that partly explains Sota Sil's later decision to forge the Cold Harbor Compact, a binding agreement with multiple Daedric princes, negotiated at great personal cost, that barred the Daedra from directly interfering in Nirn. Sota Sil basically sat down with the powers of Oblivion and made them sign a contract, and it worked for a while. Dagon's most famous single act before the Oblivion Crisis was the destruction of Mournhold, the capital city of Morrowind. During the First Era, a vengeful former spy master of Vivec summoned Dagon into the city using a witch's ritual. Dagon went well beyond what the summoners intended. He didn't just attack the Duke they were targeting, he destroyed the entire city. He devoured its populace. The whole capital of Morrowind, gone in a single Daedric rampage, beaten back only when both Almalexia and Sotha Sil fought him together and banished him back to his realm. A new Mournhold was built directly on top of the ruins of the old one, which is why, When you visit Mournhold in the Morrowind Expansion Tribunal, you're technically standing on a necropolis. The old city is down there. Then, in the Second Era, Dagon tried again, multiple times. High Kinlady Estre of the Somerset Isles made a pact with him and opened gates in various Dominion cities. The Longhouse Emperors of Cyrodiil, a dynasty that was established partly through Dagon's assistance, legalized Daedra worship and invited his influence into the empire's highest levels. The backlash to this decision was so severe that it sparked a multi-provincial rebellion that ended the Longhouse dynasty and triggered the Three Banners War that most of ESO takes place during. And then, in 4th Era, 433, the Oblivion Crisis. The Mythic Dawn cult, under the leadership of a man named Mankar Camoran, spent years secretly assassinating members of the Septim bloodline. They believed that Myrun's Dagon was the true owner of Tamriel, that the mortal world was originally his realm of oblivion, and that the Aedra had stolen it from him. If they could extinguish the Dragonborn bloodline and put out the dragon fires in the Temple of the One in the Imperial City, the covenant between Akatosh and Alessia would fail, and Dagon could march his armies through Oblivion Gates across all of Tamriel. They succeeded at the first part. They killed Emperor Uriel Septim the Seventh and every known heir. They destroyed the Dragonborn lineage. Oblivion Gates opened across the continent and Daedric forces poured through. The game, of course, is about stopping this. The hero of Kuach finds Martin Septim, the last hidden heir, and works with him to close the gates and prevent a permanent conquest. The climax sees Martin Septim shattering the Amulet of Kings to summon Akatosh himself, who appears as a divine dragon avatar and destroys Dagon's physical form, forcing him back into his realm. Dagon is defeated, but notably, he's not destroyed. He can't be. He went back to his realm, the Deadlands, where he regenerated. He's still out there. And in Skyrim, 200 years later, remnants of the Mythic Dawn are trying to open new Oblivion Gates. They're still at it, still working toward the same goal. There's something interesting about Dagon's relationship to the Dunmer, though. In Dunmer theology, Dagon is one of the four corners of the House of Troubles, the enemies of good conduct, the beings that test the Dunmer's resolve and faith. He represents the difficult nature of Morrowind itself, the harsh environment, the constant struggle. In this framing, he's not purely evil. He's a necessary adversary. The Dunmer acknowledge him and respect his power even as they oppose him. It's a more nuanced religious relationship than the simple monster to be defeated frame that other cultures apply. Here's the next one. We talked about the Hist calling the Argonians back to defend Black Marsh during the Oblivion Crisis, but the nationalist political organization that emerged from that moment and what it did afterward deserves its own section. The Engelil is a political faction of Argonians who take their guidance directly from the Hist, not metaphorically, literally. The Hist tell them what to do, and they do it. They rose to prominence during the Oblivion Crisis, when the Hist began preparing the Argonians for the coming war, and by the time the crisis hit, the Engelil were effectively running Black Marsh's military response. Their ideology is, by the standards of most Tamrielic politics, straightforward. Black Marsh should be for Argonians, the Empire should get out, and any foreign influence in Argonian territory should be removed. They're not interested in diplomacy or political maneuvering in the conventional sense. They take orders from trees that might be thousands of years old and have access to information about the future. Their policy decisions are based on a level of long-term planning that no conventional political organization can match. After the Oblivion Crisis, when the Red Year destroyed Vardenfell and flooded Morrowind with refugees, the Engelil moved. They organized the Argonian armies and marched into southern Morrowind. The Dunmer, already devastated by the volcanic eruption and the subsequent wave of undead and disasters, couldn't hold the border. The Argonians took significant territories. This was revenge that had been building for a long time. For centuries, the Dunmer had enslaved Argonians. The Dunmer Great House Dress based in southern Morrowind, was one of the major slave trading powers in Tamriel. Argonians were among the primary victims. The Angelil, with the Hist's approval, and possibly the Hist's direct planning, used the chaos of the Red Year to end that relationship permanently. The expansion of Argonian territory into Morrowind is one of the major political consequences of the Red Year, and is driven almost entirely by a nationalist faction that receives its marching orders from the oldest beings on Nirn. Whether the Hist had planned this specific outcome, or whether it was emergent from their long-term strategic vision, or whether they were just opportunistically capitalizing on the situation, we don't know. The Hist don't explain their reasoning. Alright, keep going. Let's take a breath from the big narrative arcs and just go through some of the individually strange, delightful, horrifying, or inexplicable details from across the whole of Elder Scrolls lore that didn't fit neatly into the larger sections. These are the kinds of things that make you stop mid-reading and just stare at the ceiling for a moment. The Khajiit have penile spines. This is stated in the lore. It's mentioned in one of the creature biology documents that has survived from the in-universe scholars. Khajiit, like many real-world cat species, have barbed anatomy. This is in the serious Elder Scrolls reference material, just a thing that's in there, the Glarthir situation. In Oblivion, there is a man in the city of Skingrad named Glarthir who approaches you in secret, convinced that 3 of his neighbors are conspiring to kill him. It is a paranoid delusion. None of his neighbors are doing anything of the sort. But one of the things Glarthir is afraid of is the Marukati Selectives, the ancient extremist theological sect that caused the Middle Dawn 1,000 years ago. He thinks they're watching him specifically. In the context of the lore, this is written as further evidence of his paranoia. But given some of the more esoteric sources that imply the Selectives may have survived in some form, some lore fans have pointed out that paranoid and wrong are not always synonyms. The moon's relationship to necromancy. We talked about Manimarco becoming the necromancer's moon, but before that, during the Third Era, the moons had a different relationship to death magic. When the necromancer's moon eclipses Arce's planetary sphere, it blocks the god of death's influence over soul gem restrictions, allowing black soul gems to be created. This means the necromancers of the Third and Fourth Era are essentially using a god as a lens to temporarily block another god. Manimarco managed to set himself up as a permanent cosmic phenomenon that specifically counteracts Arce's power. That's incredible, honestly. Whatever else you think of him, Manimarco committed to his bit, the sleeping tree in Skyrim. In the Reach, there's an enormous pale tree called the Sleeping Tree, surrounded by a camp of giants who guard it. It's much larger than any normal tree in Skyrim. It has a distinctive glowing bluish quality to it, and it produces a sap called Sleeping Tree Sap that has unusual properties. An NPC named Ysolda in Whiterun, who's trying to get into the Khajiit trading network and is interested in unusual substances, suggests that the Sleeping Tree might be a Hist tree. An actual Hist tree from Black Marsh, somehow growing in the middle of Skyrim. If true, and the lore doesn't confirm or deny it, there would be an interesting question about why a Hist is growing that far from Black Marsh, what it's doing there, and whether it's connected to the broader Hist network, and whether the giants guarding it have any understanding of what they're protecting, Pelinal and the Chimer. We mentioned that Pelinal once confused a group of Khajiit for elves and killed them before realizing his error. But there's a companion detail to this that's grimly funny. In the same era, Pelinal was specifically targeting Chimer, the ancient dark elves, who looked, at this point in history, fairly similar to other elves, and the Khajiit first stocks that were present in that region at that time did apparently look quite elf-like. So Pelinal, the divine champion supposedly sent to protect humanity from elven domination, accidentally committed an atrocity against the wrong species because he was in such a rage that he wasn't being careful about which specific pointy-eared people he was killing, the Void Knights and their origin. In 4th Era 98, both moons disappeared from the sky for 2 years. The Thalmor claim they used Altmeri magical rituals to restore the moons. This claim gave them enormous leverage over the Khajiit, whose entire culture and biology is tied to the moons. The Khajiit Pact, in which the Khajiit of Elsewhere formally allied with the Aldmeri Dominion, is partly a consequence of this. But did the Thalmor actually cause the moons to disappear in the first place? Were the Void Knights engineered by the Thalmor to create a problem they could then solve, giving them a permanent source of leverage over an entire civilization? The lore doesn't confirm this. But the timing and the political consequences are suggestive. The Drow and Vivec. Among the many things Vivec accomplished as a god of Morrowind was forming an alliance with the Trident Kings of the Drow, the tentacled, crab-clawed mare creatures that live in the sea and were once a dominant civilization, to help defend against the Akaviri invasion in First Era 2703. This is mentioned almost in passing in historical texts, which means there was apparently a moment where a warrior poet god sat down with the underwater crab monster civilization and negotiated a military alliance. I want an entire game about this. I want the full diplomatic details. What are the Trident King's demands? What do the Drow want from Vivec? Is there paperwork, the Slode, and the Thracian Plague? The Slode are a race of slug-like beings who live on the coral archipelago of Thras, southwest of Tamriel. They're widely considered the most universally reviled species in the setting, not because they're aggressive, but because they're necromancers by nature and essentially treat all other forms of life as potential raw material. In First Era 2200, the Slode released the Thracian Plague, which killed approximately half the population of Tamriel, millions of people. The Slode apparently did this either as an experiment or as a preemptive strike, or possibly just because they could. The response was the All Flags Navy. In First Era 2260, the largest coalition fleet ever assembled in Tamrielic history sailed to Thras and sank it. The Coral Kingdom was pulled beneath the waves. Whether the Slode survived this is unclear. Their culture and history are so alien that conventional concepts of extinction might not apply to them cleanly. But Thras is gone, and the Slode have not been a significant presence since. The Slode who were active in Tamriel before and after the plague include Nagasta, who appears in Arena and who is notable for being a sorcerer working out of Strosm Kai, who received his territory as a gift from Manimarco. The Slode and Manimarco apparently had a working relationship, which makes perfect sense when you consider that both parties have necromancy as a core competency. The Boethia thing. In the Dunmer theology, one of the key stories is Boethia defeating Trinimac by eating him. This is stated very plainly. Boethia ate Trinimac, wore his skin for a while to speak with his voice and deceive his followers, then excreted what was left, and that remainder became Malakath. This story is foundational to the Dunmer religious split from the Aldmeri religions, because the Aldmer worshipped Trinimac as a major deity, and the ancestors of the Dunmer, the Proto-Chimer who followed Veloth into Morrowind, chose to follow Boethia and Mephala and Azura instead. The implication being that the Chimer and their religion were partly built on the deliberate spiritual humiliation of an Aldmeri hero god, transformed into a Daedric prince of the spurned and cast out through divine digestive action. The Orsimer, the Orcs, are the descendants of the people who followed Trinimac before Boethia ate him, and their patron is Malakath, who is what's left of Trinimac. So the Orcs, at some deep theological level, are worshipping the excreted remnants of their original god who was consumed by another god to make a point. That's a lot to carry. Periate. Periate, the Daedric prince of pestilence and natural order, is one of the most understated princes in the setting. He doesn't get a lot of attention. His sphere sounds nasty, plague and disease, but he's actually described as a moderately benevolent Daedra by some texts, because he sees disease and pestilence as part of the natural order of things, not as cruelty. His followers include those who study disease and those who see themselves as maintaining balance in nature by occasionally letting things die off. He's Daedra adjacent to Kynareth in some ways, though that comparison would horrify both of them. Sanguine is another understated prince, the Prince of Debauchery. His signature artifact, the Sanguine's Rose, is described as an enchanted lockpick that also somehow summons a scamp. This is considered one of the less impressive Daedric artifacts. Sanguine himself is described as something like the most pleasant of the Daedric princes. He likes parties, he likes excess, he causes no permanent harm because he believes mortal pleasures are to be enjoyed and not destroyed. His followers tend to be people who like hedonistic excess. The cult of Sanguine is basically a very committed party culture. The fact that Sanguine exists as a Daedric prince alongside Molag Bal, who represents the violent violation of all good things, tells you something about the full spectrum of Daedric existence. These aren't just different flavors of the same destructive impulse. They're genuinely different philosophical orientations. Some Daedric princes want to unmake the world. Some want to make the world worse in specific ways, and some just want everyone to have a good time, as long as you're willing to make some morally questionable decisions about what counts as a good time. The towers again. Something I didn't mention in the initial section, the Snow Tower, which is the throat of the world in Skyrim, has Alduin as its associated dragon break threat. Alduin, being flung forward through time by an Elder Scroll at the end of the ancient civil war, isn't classified as a dragon break by most scholars, but some argue it has the characteristics of one. If that's true, if Alduin's banishment through time was a localized dragon break, then the towers are even more tightly connected to the events of specific games than it initially appears. The Throat of the World stone is also debated. Some say it's the Eye of Magnus. Some say it's something else buried in the mountain. Nobody's fully mapped this out. The Hist's relationship to Sithis. The Argonians, uniquely among the races of Tamriel, recognize Sithis as the original creator, the void, the chaos, the absence that predates everything. Sithis is what the Dark Brotherhood worships. The reason Argonians who are born under the sign of the shadow are given to the Dark Brotherhood at birth is this theological connection. Those Argonians become shadow scales, assassins trained from birth, accepted into the Brotherhood as full members. They spend their childhoods learning to kill, and their adulthood serving an organization that worships the void. This is the official religious policy of Argonian society, at least in some regions. Your child is born under a certain star sign, and you hand them to a guild of assassins, and they grow up to be shadow scales, who are apparently quite well regarded for their skills. The Eyelid Heartland and what the elves were doing in Cyrodiil. The Eyelids, the Wild Elves, ruled Cyrodiil from their scattered city-states for centuries before the Alessian slave rebellion ended their dominance. And they were not, in the modern imagination, a particularly cuddly civilization. They enslaved humans. They practiced some deeply unpleasant forms of magic involving human suffering and despair. Specific Eyelid elites used the concentrated essence of suffering as a power source for their magic, literal suffering, extracted from enslaved humans, used as fuel. Their cities were magnificent. The White Gold Tower, which is still standing in the Imperial City, was originally Eyelid construction. The Nirnroot, the glowing plant that alchemy questlines in multiple games revolve around, was originally a cultivated Eyelid plant that now grows wild across Tamriel after the Eyelid cities fell. And their ruins, the Eyelid ruins scattered across Cyrodiil in oblivion, are full of the residue of this civilization's magic. Soul gems, enchanted pedestals, magical traps, and the occasional very unpleasant thing in a jar. There's a group of Eyelids called the Prismatic Eyelids, or the Eyelid of the Heartland, who are noted as being among the most presumptuous of their kind, and presumptuous in this context means they were attempting to interact with the towers and with cosmic forces in ways that even other Eyelids found excessive. What specifically they were doing isn't fully documented, but the implication is that some of the deeper history of White Gold Tower involves Aelid experiments in cosmological manipulation. And yet Alessia, the hero queen who led the rebellion against the Aelids, made a covenant with Akatosh that preserved the White Gold Tower's function as an anchor of reality. The thing that the Aelids built to serve their own purposes became the linchpin of imperial civilization because Alessia negotiated its use into her agreement with the gods. It's a very pragmatic approach to revolution. We defeated the people who built this, but we're going to keep using their infrastructure. Next, let's take a moment to look at the broader picture of the towers and what the destruction of each one has meant for Tamriel, because the pattern is pretty dark. The Red Tower, Morrowind's anchor, lost its stone when the Nerevarine ended the Heart of Lorkhan's enchanted connection in 3rd Era 427. The immediate consequences included Dagoth-Ur's death, the Tribunal's loss of godhood, and then in 4th Era 5, the fall of Bardau and the eruption of Red Mountain, the Red Year. Most of Vardenfell became uninhabitable. Hundreds of thousands of Dunmer were killed or displaced. The civilization that had existed in that form for thousands of years, the Tribunal Temple and the great houses on Vardenfell, effectively ended. The Crystal Tower in Somerset was destroyed during the Daedric invasion in Elder Scrolls Online. Its stone, the Heart of Transparent Law, was stolen as part of a plan by 3 Daedric princes to remake reality. The tower fell, and the consequences haven't fully played out in the game's timeline, but the Crystal Tower's loss is significant because it was one of the anchor points for the High Elven civilization's claim to divine connection. Whether its loss contributed to the eventual decline of Altmiri power or the rise of the Talmor's more politically aggressive approach to preserving Altmiri supremacy is left as an exercise for the reader. The Brass Tower, Numidium, has been activated and destroyed multiple times. Every activation caused a dragon break. The final confirmed destruction was during the Warp in the west. What it did to the metaphysical stability of the Iliac Bay region is still being felt centuries later. What's striking is that these losses of tower function all correspond to periods of massive instability in the games. The 4th Era, where Skyrim takes place, is described in the setting as one of the most chaotic and dangerous periods in Tamrielic history. Multiple provinces in open conflict, the Empire fracturing, dragons returning, and behind all of it, the possible suggestion that reality itself is getting less stable because the infrastructure that was holding it together is failing. The Throat of the World, the Snow Tower, still stands. The Green Sap in Valenwood still stands. White Gold Tower still stands, though what happened to it during the Oblivion Crisis, when Mehrunes Dagon's physical form was defeated there, and the covenant between mortals and Akatosh was permanently altered, may have changed its function in ways nobody has fully mapped. Riften and High Hrothgar and the Reach all feel the strange temporal distortions called time wounds from events earlier in history, and those distortions are connected to how the Snow Tower interacts with time through Alduin. The metaphysical health of the Elder Scrolls world is declining. The towers are going dark. Reality is getting less stable, and every game, every era, something new breaks or falls or goes wrong. Whether there's a plan behind this, whether someone or something is deliberately pulling the towers down, or whether it's just entropy and bad choices and the compounding consequences of thousands of years of cosmic accidents, is one of the questions the franchise has been building toward for a very long time. Okay, and this one. Let's go back to Boethia for a moment, because she's one of the more interesting Daedric princes from a characterization standpoint, and her role in the history of the Dunmer specifically is enormous. Boethia's sphere is deceit, conspiracy, treachery, murder of the weak by the strong, and plots within plots. She's the Daedric prince of political scheming at its most brutal, not the polished scheming of Mephala, but the raw assertion of power through deception. She tests her followers by asking them to demonstrate strength through betrayal. The famous test, which you participate in during Oblivion's Boethia's Oblivion quest, involves luring a traveler to a shrine and sacrificing them to her satisfaction. Brutal, direct, No ambiguity about what's being asked. The Chimer became the Dunmer, went from the golden-skinned Chimer to the dark-skinned, red-eyed Dunmer because of a curse from Azura. After the tribunal's betrayal of their oaths following the Battle of Red Mountain, Azura appeared and told them their skin would be changed, and their eyes would be changed, and their afterlife would be changed, as punishment for false godhood. And the Chimer, who had followed the dissident priests of Veloth, who had abandoned the Aldmeri divines to follow Boethia and Mephala and Azura as their three good Daedra, became the Dunmer. So the Dunmer are dark-skinned and red-eyed because their gods cursed them. And they know this. It's in their religious texts. The temple teaches a specific version of events that puts the tribunal's ascent in a heroic light. But the competing Ashlander traditions are very clear that what happened was the tribunal broke a promise and got cursed for it. Boethia's most celebrated artifact is Goldbrand, a sword of extraordinary power. Her Daedric Shrine quest in Oblivion involves her using the player to defeat one of her champions who has grown too proud. Her quest in Skyrim, in which she asks you to kill a specific target as a test of devotion, is one of the darker ones in that game. But she has followers across Tamriel who see her not as evil, but as the Daedra of necessary force. The idea that power must be tested through real action, that betrayal is sometimes the highest expression of strength, that the world's order is maintained by those willing to act decisively even against those they know. The tribunal's anticipations, the Daedric princes who were prophesied to eventually reclaim the mantles that the tribunal took, are Boethia for Almalexia, Mephala for Vivec, and Azura for Sotasil. Boethia's anticipation of Almalexia makes a certain sense. Almalexia was the warrior queen, the most directly powerful of the tribunal, the most confrontational in her approaches. And Boethia is the prince of I will take what is mine through force and betrayal. When the tribunal fell, when the heart of Lorkhan was freed, and they lost their godhood, the Dunmer religion predicted this would happen. The anticipations were always supposed to reclaim what the tribunal had taken. The question was just when. And then there's this. This is the most speculative section, the most out there. The thing that even long-time Elder Scrolls lore scholars argue about whether it's meant to be taken literally or treated as a philosophical metaphor or as both simultaneously. The Godhead. In some of the deepest lore, sourced from Michael Kirkbride's external writings and a few carefully hidden in-universe texts, the entire Elder Scrolls universe takes place in the dream of a divine being called the Godhead. Everything we've discussed, every god and demon and mortal and tower and dragonbreak and piece of moon sugar, all of it, happening inside the unconscious mind of the Godhead. The Godhead is not Anu. The Godhead is something more fundamental than Anu. Anu and Padomai are within the Godhead's dream. The Aurbis is within the Godhead's dream. Everything is within the Godhead's dream. And if the Godhead wakes up, if the Godhead stops dreaming, the entire thing ends. Not in a disaster, not in an apocalypse, just stops. In the Kirkbride-influenced texts, there's a state beyond Kim called Amaranth. Amaranth is what happens when a being achieves Kim and then goes further, when they don't just maintain their individual identity within the universal dream, but actually become the Godhead themselves. They wake up from one dream and start dreaming their own. They become the creator of a new universe, a new Arbis, a new everything. They become a new Godhead. This is described as the ultimate goal, not conquest, not power, not the defeat of specific enemies. The goal, according to these texts, is for mortal beings to grow and develop and achieve Kim and eventually Amaranth and become new gods, dreaming new universes. The whole of Elder Scrolls history in this reading is the Godhead's unconscious working through the process of its own becoming, developing the tools, the races, the cultures, the heroes, the conflicts that will eventually be capable of achieving Amaranth and taking that next step. Whether this is meant as a canonical, metaphysical truth about the Elder Scrolls universe, or as a symbolic framework for understanding the game's themes of freedom and self-determination and the potential of mortal beings is deliberately left open. The texts that touch on this stuff are slippery. They resist being pinned down to a single interpretation. But it means that when you're walking around Skyrim, or fighting through Morrowind, or exploring the Shivering Isles, you're not just playing a game in a fantasy world. According to this framework, you're participating in the dream of a divine being that is in the process of developing the capacity to create its own universe. The mortals of Tamriel aren't just the subjects of this dream, they're potentially the future dreamers. That's a lot of weight for a game about killing bandits and being dragonborn. Moving right along. Let's go deeper into the Angelil and what exactly went down in the post-Red Year period, because this sequence of events is one of the most remarkable things in recent Tamrielic history, and it involves a level of strategic planning that suggests the Hist were working multiple moves ahead for a very long time. The Red Year was 4th Era 5. Red Mountain erupted catastrophically following the fall of Bardau. The eruption lasted for months. It killed enormous numbers of Dunmer on Vardenfell directly and made most of the island uninhabitable. It triggered earthquakes and ash storms and secondary disasters across mainland Morrowind. The social order of the Dunmer, built around the Tribunal Temple, the Great Houses, and the specific geographic foothold of Vardenfell, collapsed almost overnight. The Angelil had been watching, or rather, the Hist had been watching, and the Angelil were implementing the Hist's plan. During the Oblivion Crisis, when Mehrunes Dagon's forces were invading across all of Tamriel, Black Marsh was specifically targeted. The Hist, having foreseen the crisis, had already recalled most Argonians to Black Marsh and physically enhanced them for warfare. When the Daedric forces invaded Black Marsh, they found a prepared and augmented population waiting for them. And then the Argonians, again, apparently following Hist guidance, went through the Oblivion Gates, in the other direction. The Argonians counter-invaded through the Oblivion Gates into the Deadlands themselves and fought the Daedra there. In Mehrunes Dagon's own realm, the Argonians attacked a Daedric prince in his home territory. This is presented in the lore almost as a matter-of-fact historical note, and I want to emphasize, this is wild. The Daedra are supposed to have an enormous advantage in their home realms. The laws of the mortal world don't apply there the same way. The Daedra are strongest where they rule, and the Argonians went in anyway because the Hist told them to, and they apparently did enough damage that Dagon's forces were significantly disrupted in Black Marsh specifically. After the crisis ended, Black Marsh was one of the first provinces to formally secede from the Empire. The Angelil led this secession, which was essentially accomplished as a fait accompli. By the time the imperial government had recovered enough from the crisis to think about provincial governance, Black Marsh had already functionally separated. The province was renamed Argonia by some of its residents, and the new Angelil-aligned government simply declined to recognize imperial authority. Then the Red Year happened, and the Angelil moved into southern Morrowind. The territory they took had been the heartland of Housedress, the Dunmer Great House most associated with Argonian slavery. If there is any historical justice in Tamrielic history, it's here. The Argonians who had been enslaved by Housedress for generations, whose children had been torn from the Hist and whose souls had been prevented from returning properly, came back with armies organized by the oldest beings on Nirn and took the land that had been used to enslave them. The Dunmer survivors who fled Morrowind during this period went everywhere. To Skyrim, where there's a significant Dunmer refugee population in cities like Windhelm. To Solstheim, which was given to the Dunmer by the Nords as a refuge, which is why the Dragonborn DLC in Skyrim is set partly on Solstheim. To smaller enclaves across Tamriel. The great Dunmer civilization that had existed since the First Era was broken, scattered, reduced to refugees and small settlements. The Hist had been planning this for a very long time. The counterattack against Dagon's forces, the secession of Black Marsh, the invasion of southern Morrowind. All of it appears, in retrospect, to be pieces of a single strategic vision that the trees were working toward across multiple generations of Argonian lives. The Argonians themselves may not have known the full picture. They were given specific instructions, specific visions, specific impulses. The Hist held the overall plan in their collective consciousness. If you want to be deeply unsettled by the Elder Scrolls, sit with this. The most strategically effective civilization in the Fourth Era is governed by trees that have been alive for longer than most recorded history, that share a unified mind across an entire continent, that can predict the future, that communicate with their people through sap that functions as a form of soul sharing, and that have been quietly planning the current political order of Eastern Tamriel for millennia, and they look like trees. Here's something. We've mentioned the 36 lessons of Vivec a few times, but I want to give them proper attention because they're genuinely one of the most remarkable pieces of writing in any video game. The lessons are 36 short texts, each called a sermon, that Vivec claims to have written during various periods of his existence. They're cryptic, allegorical, sometimes explicit, sometimes mystical, and densely packed with references to the cosmological concepts we've been discussing throughout this video. They're not narrative in any conventional sense. They don't tell a linear story. They tell a mythological story, the way myths work, through symbol and image and repetition and contradiction. In universe, the lessons serve multiple purposes. On the surface, they're the sacred texts of the Tribunal Temple, the religious documents that define Dunmer theology and the nature of the gods. On a deeper level, they're a practical guide to spiritual development, meant to help the reader work toward the Sijic endeavor and potentially toward Kim. On a deeper level still, they're Vivec's way of encoding the truth about the Tribunal's history, including the betrayal, including the false divinity, in a form that can be read on multiple levels. The official reading is devotional. The heretical reading reveals everything. Vivec essentially hid the truth about himself in plain sight in the sacred texts, in a form that only the most sophisticated readers would recognize, and that could always be dismissed as mystical metaphor by those who preferred not to know. Sermon 12 is the one about the killing word, about power through language. Sermon 21 is the one about the wheel and the tower that provides the key to understanding Kim. Sermon 29 is the one about the moon axle, which is connected to the Nerevarine prophecies. Sermon 36, the final one, covers the Battle of Red Mountain from Vivec's perspective, and it's the one that historians find the most contested because it contradicts other sources in ways that can't be entirely reconciled. One line from the lessons, from Sermon 14, "The forfeiture of all comfort and certainty is the highest form of love." This is Vivec describing, in his usual oblique way, the nature of what the Tribunal did. They sacrificed the comfort of mortality, the certainty of the mortal world, for what they believed was love of their people. Whether that belief was genuine, whether what they did was out of love or out of ambition, is the central question the lessons leave unanswered. Vivec says, somewhere in the lessons, "So that you may know that this is true, I have recorded this to be read by our children," a direct address to the reader, an acknowledgement that the lessons are meant to survive into the future, and a subtle implication that whoever is reading them is, in some sense, Vivec's child, a product of the world he helped create. That's the kind of thing the lessons do. They pull you in. They make you feel addressed, and then they say something so dense and strange that you have to stop and think about it for a while. Next fact, and it's a good one. We've spent a lot of time on Mehrunes, Dagon, and Sheogorath, Jigalac, and Boethia, but there are 17 Daedric princes in the setting, and several of them have fascinating details worth noting. Hermaeus Mora, the Prince of Knowledge and Memory. He looks like nothing, or rather, he looks like the concept of being watched, a mass of eyes and tentacles that exists in a state of perfect informational horror. He knows everything. Every secret, every hidden truth, every forbidden knowledge. His realm, Apocrypha, is an infinite library of books that contain everything ever written or thought. His followers are scholars and sorcerers who trade pieces of themselves for knowledge. In Skyrim, he serves as the main Daedric presence in the Dragonborn DLC, where he's seeking the knowledge of the dragon language secrets that only Dragonborns can access. The interesting thing about Hermaeus Mora in the context of the broader lore is that his sphere, knowledge, puts him in a peculiar position relative to the other princes. Knowledge of the future overlaps with Jigalag's sphere of logical deduction. Knowledge of forbidden secrets overlaps with Mephalah's sphere of conspiracy. Knowledge of nature overlaps with Periate's sphere. But Hermaeus Mora's approach to knowledge is purely accumulative. He wants all of it, not to act on it, but simply to have it. His is a hoarding intelligence, vast and old, and completely indifferent to the consequences of what the knowledge he holds could do if it were used. Nocturnal, the Prince of Night, and Darkness and Luck. Her relationship to the Thieves' Guild, her three aspects, the Grey Fox, the Guardian, the Nightingale, and the nature of her contract with the Nightingales are all genuinely interesting. But what I want to note is the theoretical role Nocturnal may have played in the Elder Scrolls Online Somerset storyline, where she's part of a conspiracy with two other princes to steal the Heart of Transparent Law and use it to remake reality. Nocturnal's specific goal in this plan was to give herself control over Apocrypha as well as the Void. She wanted to expand her domain to include the space where knowledge lives, as well as the space where darkness lives. Two Daedric princes attempting to absorb each other's spheres. That's a level of ambition that even within Daedric politics is unusual. Mephala, the prince of sex and murder and secrets. There's a beautiful symmetry to Mephalah's sphere. Sex and murder are the two acts that are almost universally attended by secrets. The things people hide most carefully are the things they've done to or with each other in private. Mephala is the keeper of all those secrets, the patron of the Dark Brotherhood in some periods, the anticipation of Vivec in Dunmer theology. Her Daedric artifact, the Ebony Blade, is thematically connected to her sphere. It gets stronger the more people you kill who trust you. It rewards betrayal of intimates. Molag Bal, the Prince of Domination and Brutality, the antagonist of Elder Scrolls Online. His sphere is defined by the violation of natural order, specifically the order that comes from free will and the natural rights of beings. He created vampirism. He is the father of vampires in the lore, having created the first vampire through an act of deliberate corruption of a particularly devoted mortal. His realm, Coldharbour, is a frozen, colorless mirror of Nirn, a place where everything that exists in Nirn exists in a corrupted, drained form. Coldharbour is what Nirn looks like to Molag Bal, stripped of color and warmth and meaning, reduced to its most miserable essence. Azura, the Prince of Dusk and Dawn. She's consistently depicted as one of the more benevolent Daedric princes, not without her own ambitions and occasional cruelty, but genuinely invested in the well-being of her chosen people, particularly the Dunmer and the Khajiit. Her realm, Moonshadow, is described as extraordinarily beautiful. She's the prince who cursed the tribunal, but she's also the prince who genuinely loved the Chimer before they betrayed their oath. Her Daedric artifact, Azura's Star, is a soul gem that doesn't break after use. It can be used indefinitely. In Skyrim, it can be converted into the Black Star, which can hold humanoid souls through Mehrunes Dagon's influence. The quest that involves this conversion is one of the more interesting moral choices in Skyrim because both options have legitimate arguments behind them, Malakath and the question of his relationship to Trinimac. This one I want to linger on because the nature of what Malakath is, whether he's genuinely what's left of Trinimac or whether he's a completely different being, is philosophically significant. Malakath himself rejects the identification. He says, quite directly in some sources, that he is not Trinimac, that Trinimac is dead. But the orc culture built around him preserves echoes of the older Trinimac worship in ways that suggest some continuity. The Orsimer went from being one of the most devout peoples worshipping one of the most powerful Aedra to being the outcasts worshipping the excreted remains of that Aedra's digestion. And Malakoth, the prince of the outcasts and the spurned, is himself perhaps the ultimate outsider, a being defined by what was done to him and what he became in response. There's a dignity to that, honestly. Whatever else Malakath is, he represents the people who got knocked down and kept going. The orcs who got their lands destroyed repeatedly throughout history and kept building Orsinium, the beings who got cast out and made something worth having out of being cast out. Okay, so one of the things I love most about Elder Scrolls lore is that it doesn't just exist as grand cosmological mythology. It also has the texture of lived-in history, the small details, the cultural quirks, the things that make Tamriel feel like a place where people actually exist and do things. Khajiit naming conventions. The Khajiit use a form of address that indicates the speaker's relationship to the person being spoken about. A Khajiit speaking humbly uses this one to refer to themselves. Ragada, a word that ended up applied to the Redguards in their own language, comes from Yoku, the Redguard language, rather than Khajiit, but it's a good example of how names travel and change as cultures interact. The Barenziah situation. Barenziah is one of the most interesting figures in Elder Scrolls lore. A Dunmer princess who survived a catastrophic battle as a child, was found and raised by Imperials, became a queen, had an affair with Tiber Septim, wrote a scandalous biography that was published, then censored, then republished in an expurgated form, and eventually became one of the most politically experienced figures in Morrowind over a very long life. She was still active during the events of Morrowind. Her autobiography, The Real Barenziah, exists in both the original and the sanitized version in the games, and the differences between the two versions are illuminating about Imperial censorship. The Tsaiski invasion. In First Era 2703, an Akaviri force, the Tsaiski, who are snake-like humanoids from the continent of Akavir, invaded Tamriel. They were eventually stopped through the combined efforts of the Dunmer, who flooded Morrowind as mentioned, and the Nords, and the forces of what would eventually become the Second Empire under Riemann Cyrodiil. The interesting detail is what the Tsaiski were actually after. Historical sources suggest that Tsaiski came to Tamriel specifically looking for Dragonborn. They came hunting dragons and their Dragonborn champions. And when they found Riemann Cyrodiil, who was unmistakably Dragonborn, they stopped fighting him and pledged their loyalty to him. The invasion force became the core of Riemann's Blades, the ancient order of spies and guards who serve the Dragonborn Emperor, and who appear in Oblivion and Skyrim as the player's primary allies. So the Blades were originally a Tsaishi invasion force that switched sides when they found the right Dragonborn. They kept a lot of their Akaviri traditions, the dragon-scale armor associated with the Blades, the katana-style weapons, the specific martial culture, and they became devoted servants of the Dragonborn bloodline for the next several eras, Uriel Septim the Seventh and the Elder Scrolls themselves. Uriel Septim the Seventh is the emperor who opens Oblivion, the one you help escape from the cells, the one who's then assassinated almost immediately. And his entire reign was characterized by a peculiar phenomenon related to the Elder Scrolls, the magical artifacts of prophecy that the game series is named after. Uriel Septim the Seventh apparently had a strong sensitivity to the prophecies encoded in the Elder Scrolls, and spent much of his reign receiving prophetic visions and sending his Blades agents to fulfill or prevent various events the scrolls predicted. He was essentially managing the future based on fragmentary prophetic information from artifacts that blind anyone who tries to read them directly. The Oblivion Crisis itself was something he saw coming, not in its full specifics, but in its broad outline, and his apparent passivity in the face of his own assassination, he knew he was going to die, per some accounts, was rooted in understanding that his death was necessary for the events that would eventually save Tamriel. Whether this is wisdom or fatalism is a question the game leaves for the player to answer. The nature of the scrolls themselves. The Elder Scrolls are artifacts of extraordinary power and mysterious origin. They appear to be inscribed with prophecy, but reading them directly causes permanent blindness, the moth priests of the Imperial Library spend their entire careers learning to read the scrolls in a way that slows the onset of blindness, but even they eventually lose their sight completely. The blind moth priests of Skyrim wandering the roads are the end state of a life spent reading divine prophecy. In Skyrim, an Elder Scroll is central to the plot. It's used to learn the Dragonrend shout that specifically targets Alduin. Reading the scroll sends the Dragonborn back to a specific moment in ancient history to witness the original Dragonrend being shouted. And then reading a second scroll sends the Dragonborn to the future, to Alduin's defeat, so that they know it can be done. The Elder Scrolls can show past and future simultaneously to those sensitive enough to read them. They exist outside of normal time. They're one of the most mysterious elements in the entire setting. Their origin is unknown. Their creator, if they have one, is unknown. Their ultimate purpose is unknown. They just exist, scattered across Tamriel and beyond, inscribed with truth that blinds those who seek it. Alright, follow me on this. Let's pull together the threads of personal transcendence in the Elder Scrolls cosmology, because there's a clear three-stage progression that several of the deepest texts describe. The Psijic Endeavor is the first stage. It's the commitment to spiritual development through the old ways, the path of understanding that the Psijic order follows, the process of working toward deeper comprehension of the nature of reality and one's place in it. Most mortals who pursue this path never get very far. They develop some degree of unusual ability, some greater understanding of the world. The Psijic order exists largely to support and guide people along this path. The Psijic Endeavor is, in some texts, explicitly connected to the project that Lorkhan initiated. His motive for creating Mundus was to give mortals a place to undergo this journey of development, to create the conditions under which beings could grow toward self-understanding and eventually toward the deeper truths about existence. Kim is the second stage. The moment when someone looks at the full scope of the universal dream and says, "I exist," and makes it stick. We've described this extensively. It requires a genuine confrontation with the possibility of non-existence and the assertion of self against it. The lessons describe it as love, in the sense that the deepest love is the kind that persists even in the face of total dissolution. Beings who achieve Kim can alter reality, can step outside the normal limitations of existence, can act in ways that seem impossible to those who haven't achieved it. Vivek achieved it. Tiber Septim may have achieved it or something functionally equivalent. The list of confirmed Kim achievers is very short. Amaranth is the third stage and the most radical. It's what happens when a Kim achiever goes all the way, when instead of maintaining their identity within the Godhead's dream, they take the next step and become a new Godhead. They stop dreaming within someone else's dream and start dreaming their own. They create a new orbis, a new totality, and within that totality, the beings they imagine will eventually develop their own Psijic endeavors, and their own Kims and their own Amaranths. This is described in some texts as the love letter from the Fifth Era, a document that presents itself as a communication from the future of the Elder Scrolls timeline, describing how the sixth house was ultimately made, how the Amaranth was achieved. It's beautiful and deeply strange, and reads like science fiction filtered through mystical poetry. The purpose of the Elder Scrolls universe, in this framework, is to produce beings capable of Amaranth. The universe is the Godhead's way of developing its own successors. Every age of conflict and growth and tragedy and triumph in Tamriel's history is part of this process. The Nords and Dunmer and Argonians and Khajiit and all the rest are all participants in a cosmic developmental project, even if none of them know it, even if most of them would reject the framing if they heard it. That's a beautiful concept, and an unsettling one, because it means that even the worst events in Tamriel's history, the wars, the plagues, the dragon breaks, the Red Year, are all part of this process of growing towards something. Not justified by it, not made okay by it, but part of it. And speaking of which, I want to close out with something that I think is actually crucial to understanding why Elder Scrolls lore works as well as it does. And it's this: the best things in this lore are the things that don't get fully explained. The Dwemer. Where did they go? The question is still open. The lore has enough information to build compelling theories, but no definitive answer. And that's the point. The mystery of the Dwemer is what makes them interesting. A civilization that was smarter and more capable than anyone alive, that built machines still running thousands of years later, and they just vanished. And the hints about what happened are so carefully arranged that you can spend years reading and theorizing, and you'll still feel like you're just on the edge of the truth. Lorkhan's motives. Was he a villain? A hero? A misguided idealist? The answer is different in every culture that has a myth about him. The Nords call him Shor and honor him. The High Elves call him the Deceiver and revile him. The Khajiit have a version that makes him more complicated than either. He might have had access to Kim, he might have been trying to give mortals a path to Amaranth, he might have just been curious what would happen. The lore doesn't pin it down. Vivek's current whereabouts. Is he alive somewhere? Is he truly mortal now? Did he transcend? Did he go somewhere quiet and rest? The lore has him disappear and gives you enough fragments to theorize endlessly. The Hist's ultimate plan. What are the trees actually after? What's their long-term goal? They've been around since before recorded history. They're part of the oldest things in existence. And they're still operating, still guiding the Argonians, still making moves. Toward what? These open questions are part of what makes the Elder Scrolls so deeply satisfying as a lore experience. You're not handed complete answers. You're handed pieces, and the arrangement of the pieces is itself a kind of narrative. The gaps are meaningful, the contradictions are meaningful. The fact that nobody in the setting fully agrees on anything is meaningful. History in Elder Scrolls works the way history actually works: incomplete, partisan, full of documents written by people with agendas, preserved by institutions with their own interests, copied by scribes who made errors and editorial decisions. The truth exists somewhere, but the accounts we have of it are all filtered and partial. And in a setting where gods can literally rewrite the past, where dragon breaks make multiple contradictory versions of events simultaneously true, where Kim allows an individual to edit reality, even the basic concept of what actually happened becomes philosophically slippery. That's the thing I love most about this lore. It doesn't just build a world. It interrogates the nature of history and truth and myth-making and belief. It uses the conventions of fantasy world-building to ask genuinely interesting questions about how we know what we know and whether the stories we tell about the past are ever really capturing anything true. And it does it through books about a warrior poet god who has a spear that makes people permanently infertile, and a relationship with the Daedric Prince of Domination. So, balance, okay? 4 hours, we made it. If you watch this whole thing, you now know more about a fictional cosmology than most people know about actual history, and I respect that commitment deeply. Go drink some water, take a walk, maybe talk to another person who isn't talking about Elder Scrolls lore for once. And when you get back, there's more. There's always more. The lore goes deeper than we went today. There's a whole discourse around C0DA, the comic script that Michael Kirkbride wrote that depicts the far future of the setting. There's the specifics of every individual Daedric realm and what they're like. There's the full history of the Akaviri and what's actually on the continent of Akavir. There's the story of the Dwemer of Blackreach, the specific subgroup who were doing experiments under Skyrim for thousands of years while the rest of Tamriel forgot they were there. There's the Tsaiski. There's the implication that the Morag Tong and the Dark Brotherhood aren't just two competing assassin guilds, but represent two completely different theological positions on the nature of murder and its relationship to divinity. There's so much more. Come back sometime. I'll be here. Here's one more. Let's talk about something that Skyrim introduces in a quiet, devastating way through its Dawnguard DLC, the Snow Elves. because the Snow Elves are one of the most tragic civilizations in all of Elder Scrolls history, and their fate is directly connected to some of the setting's earliest and most significant events. The Snow Elves, who call themselves the Falmer, a word that in modern Tamrielic refers to the degenerated cave-dwelling creatures you fight in Dwemer ruins, were the elves native to Skyrim. They predated the Nord's arrival, they had a civilization, they had cities, including one called Falkreath that left its name on a modern hold. They had culture and magic and history. And then the Atmoran humans came. The history of early Skyrim, filtered through the myths of both the Nords and the Snow Elves, is one of displacement and conflict. The Atmorans, ancestors of the Nords, came down from the continent of Atmora under Ysgramor's leadership following a catastrophe in their homeland. They settled in Skyrim. And eventually, in an event called the Merethic Night of Tears, there was a mass slaughter of Atmoran colonists at the settlement of Sarthal. The Atmorans blamed the Snow Elves. The Snow Elves may have had other reasons, possibly connected to something the Atmorans found at Sarthal, possibly the Eye of Magnus, which may have been buried there. Ysgramor responded by returning to Atmora, gathering his 500 companions, a legendary group of heroes, and returning to Skyrim to wage a war of extermination against the Snow Elves. The histories that came after were written by the Nords. The Snow Elf perspective is almost entirely lost. What we have are fragments. The surviving Snow Elves, fleeing the Companions' genocide, turned to the only other civilization in the region powerful enough to offer protection, the Dwemer. And the Dwemer agreed to shelter the Snow Elves, on one condition. The Snow Elves would have to eat a specific Dwemer fungus, a substance that caused blindness. The surviving Snow Elves agreed. And the blindness spread through their population, and their children were born blind, and generation by generation their culture degraded because they couldn't see, couldn't read, couldn't maintain the traditions that depended on sight, and the Dwemer used them as servants, as slaves essentially, and then the Dwemer disappeared. In First Era 700, the Battle of Red Mountain and every Dwemer on Nirn vanished, and the Snow Elves were left in the dark, literally, with no masters, no culture to return to, no memory of what they'd been, scattered through the Dwemer ruins, where they'd spent their enslaved generations. They devolved, lost language, lost social organization, became the Falmer, the blind, feral, cave-dwelling creatures that attack on instinct, that build rough shelters and worship the Chorus insects that the Dwemer also engineered. The creatures you fight in Dwemer ruins in Skyrim are what's left of a civilization. They used to have cities, they used to have magic, they used to look at the sky, and the Dwemer took all of that from them in exchange for hiding them from genocide, and then the Dwemer disappeared and left them to degrade in the dark for thousands of years. There's one Snow Elf who survived differently. Knight Paladin Gelebor, who you meet in the Dawnguard DLC, maintained his sanity and his culture and his connection to his god Ariel because he was isolated in a specific sanctum and wasn't exposed to the degenerative conditions that afflicted his people. He's been there for thousands of years, waiting. His brother Vyther, who had been a high priest of Auriel, was corrupted by vampiric influence, infected by Molag Bal's curse, and spent those same thousands of years twisting the sanctum into a trap designed to kill Auriel himself. That's the Snow Elf endgame in Skyrim, one Snow Elf waiting in hope for a hero to come, and another Snow Elf spending millennia on an elaborate plan of deicide because of the bitterness of being cursed. Both of them alone, both of them sustained by different things, one by faith, one by rage. There's also Serana, the ancient vampire you travel with through Dawnguard, who isn't a Snow Elf, but who exists in a similar temporal dislocation, woken from thousands of years of sleep into a world that's moved on without her. The Dawnguard DLC is, at its heart, about beings displaced from their own times and what that does to people. So, next thing, the Reach is a region of Skyrim, the westernmost hold, characterized by its harsh rocky landscape and the distinctive reddish stone formations that give it its name. And its native population, the Reachmen, known in Skyrim's era as the Forsworn, have one of the most interesting and tragic stories in the game. The Reachmen claim that the Reach has always been theirs, that before the Nords pushed into that territory, before the First Era, the Reach was their homeland. And unlike a lot of political claims in Elder Scrolls, where the history is murky enough that you can't really verify either side, the Reachmen's claim has some serious support. The Reachmen practice a form of magic that most people in Tamriel consider primitive or barbaric: hedge magic, nature magic, connections to beings called the Hagravens, who are women who traded their humanity for magical power through a ritual involving bird feathers and Hagraven transformation. But this magic is old. Old in a way that resonates with some of the deepest pre-imperial history of the region. The Reachmen's shamans and witches are tapping into something that predates the organized schools of magic that the Mages Guild teaches. Hagraven, by the way, is a fascinating piece of the lore. Hagraven are women, specifically women who chose to become Hagraven through a transformation ritual, who gave up their mortality in exchange for magical power and an extended, if unpleasant, existence. They have bird features, sharp talons, feathered wings, and access to magic that blends nature magic with a kind of dark power. In exchange for this power, they lose most of their humanity. They become something between a person and a predator, deeply self-interested, prone to violence, but still capable of complex thought and motivation. The Forsworn in Skyrim are treated as terrorists by the Nord-dominated imperial government of the Hold. The game's backstory is that the Reachmen briefly gained control of their homeland during a period of chaos, the Markarth incident, in the early 4th Era, and were then expelled when Ulfric Stormcloak retook the city. The retaking was brutal enough that the Empire had to look the other way when Ulfric purged the Reach of Reachmen. The survivors went into the hills, became the Forsworn, started conducting raids and killing people. From the Imperial and Nord perspective, they're dangerous criminals. From the Reachmen's perspective, they're a dispossessed people fighting to reclaim their homeland. The game actually gives you enough information to see both sides clearly, which is more political nuance than a lot of fantasy games bother with. There's also a specific dungeon, Karthspire, that leads to the Ancient Blade's stronghold of Skyhaven Temple, and in getting there, you deal with Forsworn who are also Hagravens, and who have very specific ritualistic practices connected to the magic of the Reach. The Blade's temple itself, carved into a cliff face, bears Tsaiski motifs, confirming the Blade's Akaviri origin even in a structure built to serve Dragonborn emperors of Tamriel. The Reach has its own relationship to the Tower's lore too. The Forsworn magic may be connected to the Greensap Tower's influence, extending further north than Valenwood. Or it may be something older and more localized. The exact nature of what the Reachmen are tapping into is one of the things Skyrim doesn't fully explain, and also the Nord's relationship to the Thu'um, the voice, the Stormcall, the shouts, is one of the most distinctive elements of Skyrim's setting, and it connects to some genuinely interesting cosmological ideas. In Nordic mythology, the world was sung into existence. Not just metaphorically, the Nords believe that at the beginning there was the Etada, yes, the Etada again, the original spirits, and these spirits created Mundus through a cosmic song. The idea of creation through sound and vibration is the Nord equivalent of the cosmological concepts we've been discussing. The tonal architecture that the Dwemer used was their technological application of the same principle. Reality has an underlying resonance, and if you understand that resonance, you can interact with reality at its most basic level. The Thu'um is the mortal expression of this principle. Dragons are creatures of pure voice. Their language, Dovazul, is not just a means of communication, but a mechanism for operating on reality. When a dragon shouts Yol, it's not just saying fire. The word Yol is fire on a fundamental level, the word and the thing are the same thing in the dragon language. Dragonborn mortals, humans, and mer, who have the dragon blood, can absorb the souls of slain dragons and use the power of those souls to learn the Thu'um without the decades of meditation that ordinary mortals need. The Greybeards, the masters of the voice in Skyrim, spend their entire lives learning to control the power of even small shouts. Dragonborn mortals can pick up the same shouts in minutes. The reason for this is explained in the Skyrim lore through the concept of the gift of the dragon blood, the dragonborn blood that Akatosh's covenant with Alessia introduced into the imperial lineage. But also, on a more fundamental level, because dragonborn mortals contain a dragon's soul alongside their mortal one. When they speak the words of the Tuum, they're drawing on that dragon nature. They're partly dragon in a cosmological sense. Alduin, the World Eater, is the first and oldest of the dragons. He's described as Akatosha's firstborn son, or possibly as Akatosh himself in a different aspect, the aspect that devours rather than creates, the end of time rather than the measure of time. The ancient Nords didn't destroy him because they couldn't. They used the Thu'um in a specifically targeted way, the Dragonrend shout, to make Alduin experience mortality, to force him to know what it is to be finite and mortal, and then used an Elder Scroll to fling him forward through time into the Fourth Era, where the last Dragonborn would be there to deal with him. This is quite a lot of burden to place on someone who just wanted to be a blacksmith in Riverwood or whatever the Dragonborn was doing before getting arrested and nearly executed. The Greybeards Monastery at High Hrothgar, the Throat of the World, is built on a site associated with Jürgen Windcaller, a Nord hero, after witnessing the devastation that uncontrolled Tuum could cause, devoted himself to a philosophy of using the voice only for meditation and understanding, not for war. His followers, the Greybeards, follow this philosophy with such commitment that they can barely speak in ordinary conversation. Their voices have become so powerful that even ordinary words carry dangerous resonance. The Greybeard Arngir, who speaks for the Order in Skyrim, chooses every word with enormous care. Paarthurnax, the Greybeard's master and the most ancient living dragon on Nirn, sits at the very top of the mountain and has been meditating for thousands of years. He used to be Alduin's lieutenant during the Dragon War in the Merethic era. He switched sides and taught the ancient Nords how to use the Thu'um. And he's been trying to overcome his own dragon nature, the predatory, dominating impulse that all dragons carry, through millennia of meditation. Whether he's succeeded is left deliberately uncertain in Skyrim. He says he still struggles with his darker impulses. He says overcoming one's nature is the work of a lifetime, or in his case, of multiple eras. There's no clean resolution to his arc, he's still working on it. Okay, this one. The Elder Scrolls has a long history of secret organizations operating in the shadows of the main political structures, and they're worth cataloging because the connections between them are fascinating. The Blades were originally, as we discussed, Tsaesci Akaviri invaders who became Dragonborn servants when they recognized Reman Cyrodiil as the Dragonborn they'd come looking for. They maintained their organizational structure and many of their Akaviri traditions while adapting to serve the Empire. Their role was officially to serve and protect the Dragonborn emperors, but in practice they also functioned as the Empire's intelligence service. They investigated threats to the Empire, gathered information, ran agents. During the Septim Era, the Third Era, the era of most of the games, the Blades were a significant organization with chapters across Tamriel. By the time of Skyrim, they'd been decimated. The Thalmor made hunting and killing Blades a condition of the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that ended the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion. The Empire agreed to this. The surviving Blades went into hiding. There are 3 of them left when Skyrim starts. The Mythic Dawn, which we discussed in the Mehrunes Dagon section, presented itself as a mystery cult. They operated through secrecy and gradual initiation. Potential recruits were given volumes of Monkar Camoran's commentaries, which are presented as philosophical texts but which actually encode the cult's theology and eventually function as recruitment material. The commentaries contain some of the more interesting philosophical material in the games. Mankar Camoran is clearly a genuine believer in his theology, even if his conclusions are ones most people would find monstrous. The Morak Tong are the Dunmer Assassin Guild, officially sanctioned by the Dunmer government and the Tribunal, with contracts called writs of execution that are legally recognized documents. They specifically target political enemies through formally conducted assassination. The Dark Brotherhood, by contrast, operates outside any legal framework, serves a religious purpose connected to cities, and takes contracts on anyone for any reason. The theological distinction between them is fascinating. The Morak Tong see assassination as a civic function, removing specific dangers from society through targeted action with legal accountability. The Dark Brotherhood sees assassination as a sacrament, killing as an expression of devotion to Sithis, the Void God, the shadow that predates existence. One organization is essentially a licensed profession. The other is a death cult with elaborate internal mythology. Both exist because the Elder Scrolls universe takes its world building seriously enough to think through the full implications of a society that has produced both types. The Thieves Guild in Skyrim has a secret covenant with Nocturnal that most guild members don't know about. The senior members, the Nightingales, have made specific deals with the Daedric Prince of Night and Luck that bind their souls to service of the Twilight Sepulchre after death. The Nightingales aren't just elite thieves, they're Nocturnal's champions in the mortal world, bound to protect her shrine in Nightingale Hall. After death, their souls go to the Evergloam, Nocturnal's realm, not to Sovngarde or whatever afterlife their culture might otherwise promise them. This is a contract most of them entered without fully understanding what they were agreeing to. The guild member who eventually gets pushed into taking the Nightingale Oath in Skyrim is you, the player, and the nature of what you're agreeing to is kind of glossed over in the enthusiasm of getting access to some really good armor. The College of Winterhold, the mages organization in Skyrim, has its own historical layers. It predates Skyrim's time period by a significant amount, established in the First Era as one of the major centers of magical learning in Tamriel. The city of Winterhold was once a significant port city on the north coast of Skyrim, one of the major cities of the province. And then, approximately a generation before the events of Skyrim, most of the city collapsed into the sea during an event called the Great Collapse. The only part that survived was the college. Whether the college caused the Great Collapse through some magical mishap, or whether the Great Collapse happened for other reasons and the college survived because of magical protections, is the central question of Winterhold's politics in Skyrim. The townspeople blame the college, the mages deny it. The truth is left ambiguous, though there are hints that the Void Knights and the disappearance of the moons may have caused geological instability that the college had nothing to do with. Right, next. The specific nature of the Dragonborn bloodline and the Dragonfire's covenant is worth understanding fully, because it underpins several games' plots in ways that aren't always spelled out clearly. When Alessia died after leading the Slave Rebellion and founding the First Empire of Cyrodiil, she had already made her covenant with Akatosh. The covenant had two parts. Akatosh's side: maintain a barrier between Mundus and Oblivion, preventing the mass entry of Daedra into the mortal world. Alessia's side: ensure that her bloodline maintained the Dragonborn nature and that the Dragonfires in the Temple of the One remained lit. The Amulet of Kings, whose centerpiece is the gem called the Chimel Adabal, was the physical token of this covenant, given to Alessia and passed down through the imperial line. The mechanism worked like this: as long as a Dragonborn heir ruled as emperor and maintained the Dragonfires, Akatosh would enforce the barrier. The Daedric princes couldn't send their forces physically into Nirn in large numbers. They could send agents, champions, individual manifestations. But a full-scale Daedric military invasion required the barrier to fail. This is why the Mythic Dawn's plan in Oblivion was specifically to kill all the Dragonborn heirs and extinguish the Dragonfires. Not to kill the Emperor as an act of terrorism, but to void the covenant that was keeping Tamriel safe from Oblivion. The barrier's failure after the Oblivion Crisis, after Martin Septim shattered the amulet to summon Akatosh as a dragon avatar to destroy Mehrunes Dagon's physical form, was permanent. The covenant is gone. The Septim bloodline is ended. The Dragonfires are out. Akatosh's intervention in that moment was extraordinary and unrepeatable. Without the covenant, the protection is gone. And yet the Daedra haven't invaded en masse since the Oblivion Crisis. Why? One answer is that the chaos of the crisis, the devastation to Tamriel's infrastructure and population, the political instability that followed, simply made Tamriel less attractive as a conquest target for the moment. The Daedric princes work on their own timelines. Mehrunes Dagon was defeated. The others don't necessarily have his specific agenda. Another answer, hinted at in the deeper lore, is that what Martin Septim did by merging with the amulet and calling down Akatosh created a new, different arrangement. Not the old covenant with its specific requirements, but something else. A residual divine protection that doesn't require Dragonborn emperors or lit fires to maintain, but is also weaker and less reliable. This would explain why Daedra can still cause significant trouble in the Fourth Era, the Deadlands faction in Skyrim's Apocalypse DLC, for instance, but can't do what they did in the Oblivion Crisis. The Dragonborn nature, the Dragon Blood, also apparently has properties beyond just the ability to use the tomb and operate the totem of Tiber Septim. In some texts, it's implied that the Dragonborn is a kind of cosmic role, like the Shazareen, that gets filled by whoever is currently needed. Tiber Septim was Dragonborn. The last Dragonborn of Skyrim is Dragonborn, and the implication is that the Dragonborn nature is something that Akatosh can bestow on mortals when the situation requires it, not just a hereditary bloodline, but a capacity that the Dragon God of Time can activate in specific people at specific moments. This makes the last Dragonborn in Skyrim less a random accident of birth and more a deliberate choice by Akatosh, a being called into existence with the specific capacities needed for the specific threat of Alduin's return. The Dragonborn wasn't just born with those abilities. They were placed there by the God of Time, because the God of Time needed someone with those abilities at that moment in history. Alright, next. We've talked about the Battle of Red Mountain and its aftermath several times, but Dagoth-Ur, the main antagonist of Morrowind, deserves his own section, because his story is one of the more genuinely tragic ones in the series. Vorin Dagoth was one of the great lords of the Chimer, a trusted advisor and companion of Indoril Nerevar. He was the one who discovered what the Dwemer were doing with Lorkhan's heart. He was the one who reported it to Nerevar, which triggered the chain of events that led to the war. He was there at the Battle of Red Mountain. He was there in the Heart Chamber. After the battle, in the most commonly accepted account, the tribunal went back and used Kagernak's tools on the heart without Nerevar's permission, drawing divine power from it and becoming gods. Dagoth-Ur, still called Vorin Dagoth at this point, reportedly tried to stop them, or at the very least tried to take the tools for himself, and the tribunal struck him down, left him for dead. But he wasn't dead. The heart's power had touched him. He was changed by proximity to the divine artifact. And he lay there, below Red Mountain, slowly healing, slowly being transformed by the power of the heart that he was near. For over 2,000 years, while the tribunal ruled Morrowind above him, he lay in the depths, regenerating, being reshaped by the divine energy of Lorkhan's heart into something that was no longer entirely what he'd been before. He came back. Around Second Era 882, Dagoth-Ur, as he now called himself, awoke and claimed the power of the heart for himself, cutting the tribunal off from their source of divinity. They could no longer fully recharge their divine power. He began building the Sixth House, his own faction, loyal to him, spreading the blight disease that warped animals and people in Morrowind. The sixth house operated through dreams. Dagoth-Ur could project himself into the minds of sleeping people across Morrowind and Vardenfell, recruiting them through their dreams, offering them a vision of his purpose and pulling them into his service. His followers, the Ash Vampires, the Sleepers, the afflicted people of the sixth house, were connected to him through this dream network and through the power of the heart. What did Dagoth-Ur actually want? This is where it gets interesting, because the game Morrowind lets you talk to him, actually sit down and have a conversation with the main villain. And what he says is complicated. He doesn't frame himself as evil, he frames himself as the legitimate guardian of the Heart of Lorkhan, which he was entrusted with by Nerevar before the battle. He frames the tribunal as usurpers, who broke their oaths and took divine power that didn't belong to them. He sees himself as continuing Nerevar's work. The sixth house's specific horror, the blight, the corpus disease, the twisted creatures, he presents as consequences of using the heart's power in ways it's not meant to be used. Not as cruelty, but as the necessary cost of a process he's trying to complete. Whether this framing is genuine or delusional is left to the player. Dagoth-Ur has been alone in the dark for thousands of years, sustained by the power of a divine artifact, watching his old friends become gods above him. His mind and his sense of self have been warping along with his body. The person who woke up from that long sleep is not the same person who lay down. But he's also not wrong about some specific facts. The tribunal did break their oath. They did take power that wasn't theirs. The Ashlander traditions that preserve Alandro Sul's version of the Battle of Red Mountain are a more accurate account of what actually happened than the temple's official version. When the Nerevarine defeats Dagoth-Ur by destroying the bindings on the heart and freeing Lorkhan's power, which kills Dagoth-Ur by severing his connection to his divine source, there's a quiet tragedy to it. He'd been holding on for thousands of years. He'd built something, even if what he built was terrible. He had a purpose, even if the purpose had been warped beyond recognition. And he dies in the moment the heart is freed, which is also the moment the tribunal lose their godhood, which is also the moment the Red Tower Stone is freed. One action kills the villain, ends the tribunal's false divinity, and begins the countdown to the Red Year. Everything is connected. Nothing ends cleanly. So this one, I want to take a moment to advocate for something. The in-game books of Elder Scrolls are genuinely worth reading, not just as lore delivery, but as literature. Because some of them are extraordinary pieces of writing in their own right. The Real Barenzaya is a biography, or really a romantic drama, about the Dunmer Queen Barenzaya, told through multiple volumes. The original version was so scandalous that the Empire censored it. The censored version is what most people in Cyrodiil can get. The uncensored version includes her affair with Tiber Septim and details about the consequences of that affair that the Empire preferred to suppress. Cities is a philosophical text on the void god worshipped by the Dark Brotherhood, and it's a surprisingly thoughtful exploration of what it means to worship an entity that represents absolute non-being. The author wrestles seriously with the question of how you can devote yourself to the thing that represents the end of all devotion. The Argonian account is a comedic adventure told in 4 volumes about a Nord who travels to Black Marsh and encounters Argonian culture from the outside perspective. It's funnier than most people expect Elder Scrolls books to be, and it's also more empathetic to the Argonians than most Imperial authored texts. The lusty Argonian maid is a running joke in the community because it's obviously erotica and it appears in basically every game. But it's also genuinely competent comedic erotica, which suggests that its in-universe author, Crassius Curio, who appears as an NPC in Morrowind, was better at this specific genre than he had any business being. Varieties of Faith in the Empire is one of the most useful lore documents in the series, a comparative religion survey that covers most of the major racial pantheons and explains how they relate to each other. Reading it is how you start to understand that Akatosh and Auriel and Alkosh and Bormahu are all the same fundamental entity viewed through different cultural lenses. A brief history of the Empire covers the history of the Third Empire across 4 volumes, and reading all of it gives you the political framework that underlies the events of Oblivion. The author has an obvious imperial bias, but the facts are mostly accurate, and the narrative is genuinely engaging. The annotated Anuad is one of the key creation myth texts we've referenced throughout this video. It's presented as a scholarly work annotating a much older foundational text, and the layering, the original myth plus the scholar's commentary plus the game presenting this as a historical document creates a beautiful sense of depth. And then there's the Lessons of Vivek, which we've discussed extensively, but which really does reward reading in full even knowing what they are. The density of the lessons is such that you catch new things on every reread. It's one of the few genuinely esoteric texts in gaming, not pretending to be esoteric, actually esoteric, in that its full meaning requires engagement and reflection, rather than just passive reading. The in-game library of Elder Scrolls is one of the most ambitious pieces of world building in gaming, and the fact that most players run past the books to get to the next quest is simultaneously understandable and genuinely sad. If you've never sat down and spent a few hours just reading in Morrowind or Skyrim, I genuinely encourage it. The world gets about 5 layers deeper. Here we go. Sotha Sil is the least public of the tribunal gods. While Vivek held court and Almalexia was the face of divine mercy for the Dunmer people, Sotha Sil withdrew from the world almost entirely. He built the Clockwork City, a mechanical construct hidden deep in an unspecified location in Morrowind, and spent his divine existence there, working on a project that he never fully explained to anyone. The Clockwork City is a mechanical reproduction of Tamriel. Everything in it is made of metal and gears and enchanted mechanisms. The people who live there, called the Dunmer of the Clockwork City, or Apostles, are mortal but have access to Sotha Sil's mechanical works. The city has its own ecosystem, its own culture, its own relationship to the divine. What was Sotha Sil actually trying to accomplish in there? Several accounts suggest he was working towards something called the Nirn ensuing, a process by which the mortal world would be improved, not just maintained, actually made better in a fundamental way. Sotha Sil apparently believed that the Mundus as it existed was flawed, that the creation of Nirn was a compromised process, that the world was not what it could be, and that it was possible, through sufficient understanding of the underlying mechanisms, to fix it. Not in a destructive, dragon break way, in a careful, methodical, Sotha Sil way. His personal history with Mehrunes as Dagon, losing his entire family and community to Dagon's attack on Alt-Sotha, seems to have been a motivating factor. He forged the Cold Harbor Compact with the Daedric princes in part because he understood that if the world was to be made better, the princes' interference needed to be managed, not just endured. In the Morrowind Expansion Tribunal, the player visits Mournhold to find Almalexia in the process of going completely mad after losing her divinity. She murders Sotha Sil, kills him in his Clockwork City, because she's become convinced that she's the only one who can lead the Dunmer, and that Sotha Sil's silent experiments are a threat to her authority. She never understood what he was doing, none of the tribunal did, and his death means his work is unfinished. The Nirn ensuing, whatever it would have been, doesn't happen. All those eras of careful mechanical work in the Clockwork City are left incomplete. In Elder Scrolls Online's Clockwork City DLC, you actually visit the city during the Second Era, before Sotha Sil's death, before the Tribunal's fall, and you see it in operation. There's a moment where Sotha Sil speaks directly about his goals, and it's genuinely moving. He's not arrogant about what he's trying to do. He's humble about the scale of the undertaking. He knows he might fail. He knows it might take longer than his life, but he keeps working. There's something very human about that. from a being who stopped being mortal thousands of years ago. And here's where it gets interesting. This is the most speculative section of the video, so I'll flag that clearly. But I think it's worth laying out what the lore seems to be pointing toward as an endgame, even if the games haven't gotten there yet. The Elder Scrolls universe has a concept of kalpas, cycles of existence, each one ending in an apocalyptic event and then being replaced by a new kalpa. This is connected to Alduin's role as the World Eater. His purpose, cosmologically, is to devour the world at the end of each kalpa so that a new one can begin. The ancient Nords who banished him through time were not preventing the end of the world in the ultimate sense, they were delaying the kalpa's completion. The Dragonborn who defeats him in Skyrim is ending his premature attempt to devour the world before the kalpa is complete, not preventing the world from ever ending. The world will end eventually. The question is when, and what comes after. C0DA, Michael Kirkbride's post-Bethesda project about the far future of the Elder Scrolls setting, depicts the end of the Fifth Era and beyond. In it, the landfall is coming, an event where the Numidium is reactivated again and begins a process that will end the current Kalpa. And the hope, in C0DA's vision, is that by that point mortals will have developed enough, will have achieved enough psychic endeavor and Kim and Amaranth that someone will manage to start the next dream before the current one ends. Whether this is canonical or Kirkbride's personal speculative theology or both simultaneously is, as always, left appropriately ambiguous. But as a vision of what Elder Scrolls is about, what all the wars and dragon breaks and tower failures and cosmic tragedies have been building toward, it's beautiful. A universe that exists to produce its own successors. Gods who are themselves in process of becoming. Mortals who are, slowly, working their way toward the capacity to dream new worlds. Everything ends, but before it does, something happens that makes the ending a beginning rather than just a stop. Okay, and one more. Let me bring it back to the beginning one more time. Because after everything we've discussed, the towers, the dragon breaks, the Dwemer, the Tribunal, the Numidium, the Khajiit lunar lattice, the Hist, Vivec, Pelinal, the Sijic Order, Manimarco, Sheogorath, Tiber Septim, there is one thing that connects almost all of it. Lorkhan's heart, the physical cardiac organ of the missing god who made the world. Still beating. Located under Red Mountain in Morrowind, it was the stone of the Red Tower, one of the cosmic anchors of reality. It was what the Dwemer found and tried to use to make themselves gods. It was what Kagrenak's tools interacted with, and what caused the Dwemer to disappear. It was what the Tribunal used to give themselves divinity. It was what Dagoth Ur drew on for thousands of years to sustain himself. It was what the Nerevarine freed. And before all of that, it was Lorkhan, the god who arguably started everything by deciding that the Orbis needed a mortal world in the middle of it. The world exists because of his decision. The Aedra are weakened because of his decision. The Daedra are what they are because they refused his invitation. The Khajiit are connected to the moons because those moons are what's left of his body. The Argonian souls cycle through the Hist in a system that Sithis, Lorkhan's connection, his shadow, his primordial opposite, acknowledges as part of the order of things. The Nord mythology is built around the idea of Shor, the version of Lorkhan who sacrificed everything for humanity. Even in death, even with his heart ripped out and his body thrown into space, Lorkhan kept shaping everything. His heart kept the Red Tower stable for thousands of years. His absence kept driving the question of what the world is for and what mortals owe to their creators and what happens after death. And when the Nerevarine freed the heart, when the bindings were broken and the heart dissolved into the world, that dissolution rippled outward. The Red Tower went dark, the Tribunal lost their power. Red Mountain erupted, the civilization of Vardenfell ended. And also, presumably, whatever Lorkhan's heart was still doing, in a cosmic sense, whatever stabilizing, anchoring, divine function it was still performing just by existing and beating under the mountain, that stopped. The most recent games in the Elder Scrolls timeline, Oblivion, Skyrim, take place in a world where Lorkhan's heart is gone, where the Red Tower's stone has been released, where one of the fundamental cosmic anchors of Mundus is simply not there anymore, and the world is getting increasingly unstable. Alduin came back, dragons returned, the Empire is fracturing. Things that should be impossible are happening. All of that tracing back to one god who wanted to create a place where mortals could grow and change, who convinced or tricked the other spirits into helping, who got his heart torn out for it, and whose heart kept beating for eons after he should have been beyond all of this. There is an argument to be made, and some of the lore supports it, that Lorkhan won, that his project succeeded, that despite everything the Aedra and Daedra and mortals and gods did to each other in the aftermath of his creation, the mortal world produced exactly what he wanted it to produce. Beings capable of understanding themselves, capable of growth, capable of eventually approaching Kim and Amaranth and becoming something new. Or maybe he was just a selfish idealist who caused immeasurable suffering for an outcome he couldn't predict. Both things can be true. In Elder Scrolls, they usually are. Final one. Before we actually close out, let me dump a bunch of smaller things that deserve at least a mention because they've been living in my brain and they belong here. Pelinal and the Red Diamond. The Song of Pelinal describes him as a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves, whose facets could unsector and form into a man, and the centerpiece of the Amulet of Kings. The covenant between Akatosh and Alessia is called the Chim el Adabal, which translates roughly to the Red Diamond. The implication that Pelinal and the Chim el Adabal are somehow the same object or aspects of the same thing, or that Pelinal carried the red diamond in some form. This is one of those lore connections that exists in the background and rewards thinking about. The histories deal with Molag Bal. We mentioned that a specific history in the village of Hajuk Sit made a deal with Molag Bal, the Daedric prince of domination, to save its people by allowing the village to be transported to Cold Harbor, where the Hist was then essentially kept as a prisoner, its sap harvested through a vampiric crystal for eternity. The Hist entered this deal to preserve its people, and the deal worked. In a sense, the village survived, but the tree suffered horribly for it. This is one of the few cases where the Hist's collective wisdom appears to have led to a genuinely terrible outcome. Whether the other Hist knew about this deal, whether they consented to one of their number being sacrificed this way, is unknown. The hive mind is not perfectly unified. Individual trees can make choices the collective doesn't endorse. The rogue Hist that helped summon Umbriel is another example of this. The nature of the Numidium's consciousness. Numidium is described in some texts as genuinely alive, not just as a machine. The souls of the Dwemer, if the theory that Kagranak's experiment merged the Dwemer with the Numidium is correct, would form a kind of living substrate for the construct. The Numidium would be, in this reading, not just a giant robot, but a collective entity composed of millions of Dwemer souls. Their nihilistic philosophy, their rejection of the divine, would be encoded in the very material of its being. This makes Numidium not just a weapon, but an argument. A philosophical position given physical form, powered by the essence of the civilization that held that position. When Numidium says no to the divine order of Tamriel, it's not a machine refusing a command. It's potentially an entire people, millions of voices in one, making the same refusal they made in life. We do not accept the authority of your gods. The Dunmer word for themselves. Dunmer in the Dunmeri language means dark people or cursed people, a reference to Azura's curse that changed their appearance. But the Dunmer have complex feelings about this. Some texts show Dunmer who consider the curse a mark of distinction, a sign of their history and their strength in surviving it. Others mourn what was taken from them, the golden skin of their Khmer ancestors, the connection to the Aldmeri tradition they abandoned. The name carries both shame and pride, which is pretty much the most Dunmer thing possible, the Giants of Skyrim. The giants that wander the plains of Skyrim with their mammoths are one of the more understated mysteries in that game. They clearly have intelligence, they keep mammoths, they build camps, they perform astronomical rituals by burning specific things under the stars. But they don't speak to the player, and the game doesn't explain their culture in any depth. Some texts suggest giants are descended from ancient Nords who worshipped Shor and were transformed or simply evolved differently. Others treat them as a non-human species entirely. The milk, which is a resource harvested from their camps, has unusual properties in alchemy. None of this is fully explained. The Eye of Magnus. The powerful artifact at the center of Skyrim's College of Winterhold questline is presented as an ancient Aelid artifact of great and incomprehensible power. The Sigic Order takes it away at the end, treating it as too dangerous for mortal hands. What it actually is, where it came from, what it's connected to, what happens when it's contained, is never fully explained. Some theories connect it to the Snow Tower, to the Throat of the World, to the tower's mythology. Others see it as something from outside the conventional Elder Scrolls cosmology entirely. The Sigic Order keeps it in their vault. Whether it stays there through the Fifth Era is anyone's guess. The reason Sheogorath is afraid of Jiggalag's return. In the Shivering Isles, when Sheogorath first acknowledges that he becomes Jiggalag, there is a moment of genuine fear, not performance, not theatrical madness, actual, quiet fear. And it makes sense when you think about what it means. Every Grey March, Sheogorath stops existing. His consciousness is subsumed by Jiggalag's. He doesn't remember anything that happened while he was Yiggalag. From Sheogorath's perspective, the Grey March is his own periodic death, the interruption of his continuous subjective experience. He blinks out of existence and something else wears his body for a while, and Sheogorath, as manic and chaotic as he is, very much does not want to stop existing, the two-headed ruling king. One of the more cryptic passages in the Kim literature describes the ideal ruler as a two-headed king, someone who has integrated two opposing natures into a single being. This image recurs in different contexts. Tiber Septim as both conqueror and emperor, both Talos and Hjalti, Vivek as both warrior and poet, both male and female. The enantiomorph, the configuration of two people merging into one ruling oversoul. The idea of transcendence through union of opposites, rather than through the elimination of one half, shows up throughout the cosmological texts in ways that feel deeply non-Western in their philosophical framework. The Kalpa theory and Lorkhan's relationship to previous cycles. If the Elder Scrolls universe operates in Kalpas, if the world has ended and begun again multiple times, then Lorkhan's creation of Mundus might not be a unique event. He might have done this before. The same spirits, the same players, the same fundamental conflict between the desire to create a mortal world and the resistance of those who would lose power by participating in it, playing out over and over with different specific variations, but the same essential structure. Whether the mortals of each Kalpa know they're in a cycle, whether anyone ever breaks the cycle the way Jiggalag's cycle was broken, is one of the ultimate open questions. There's a line somewhere in the lessons that goes, in translation, something like, the same song but with a new singer. The idea that history is repetitive but not identical, that each Kalpa is a new song with the same notes arranged differently, and that the goal, the Amaranth, the new godhead, the dream of a new universe, might be something that's been approached but not achieved in previous Kalpas, and that this Kalpa might be the one where someone finally crosses that line. Or maybe not. Maybe this Kalpa ends like the others. The Numidium says no, the world folds, and another dream begins somewhere. And that's Elder Scrolls lore. Beautiful, tragic, absurd, dense, contradictory, rewarding. constantly building towards something that remains permanently just out of reach. Stay curious about it. It deserves the curiosity.